Chapter 761. Avalon's Grand Ball 11. The second evening of the Grand Ball had transformed the Imperial Palace into something approaching pure magic. As midnight approached and the world prepared to welcome 2048, the celebration had reached a crescendo that would be remembered for decades. Every surface gleamed with enchanted lighting that shifted through spectrums of color, while the music and laughter of hundreds of international dignitaries created an atmosphere of genuine joy despite the underlying political tensions. I stood on one of the palace's grand terraces with my 5 girlfriends, watching as fireworks began to paint the sky above Avalon City in brilliant displays of light and color. The temperature control systems maintained perfect comfort despite the December date, allowing us to enjoy the outdoor spectacle without any of winter's usual inconveniences. 10 minutes until midnight, Rose observed, checking the elegant timepiece that had been a gift from her father. Are we ready for this? The question carried more weight than might have been apparent to casual observers. Tonight wouldn't just mark the transition to a new year. It would mark the beginning of the most challenging period any of us had ever faced. The decisions made and actions taken in the coming months would determine the fate of the Empire and potentially the entire continent. As ready as we can be, I replied, though the weight of Isolde's advice from 3 days earlier continued to influence my thinking. The strategic wisdom of waiting until summer break had become more apparent with each passing day, as I continued to receive reports about guild expansion projects and political developments that would significantly strengthen my position over the coming months. Cecilia moved closer to my left side, her crimson dress rustling softly in the evening breeze that carried the scent of the palace gardens. You've been quieter than usual since the opening night, she observed with the perceptive insight that made her such an effective crown princess. Are you having second thoughts about our plans? Not second thoughts exactly, I said carefully, not wanting to reveal the full details of my conversation with Isolde. More like refined timing considerations. Rachel stepped up to my right side, her golden hair catching the reflected light from the fireworks display. Despite the emotional stress of dealing with her supposedly resurrected mother's presence, she had shown remarkable resilience throughout the 3-day celebration. Whatever you're thinking, we trust your judgment, she said quietly. The important thing is that we're all committed to preventing the tragedy you've described. Serafina and Reika positioned themselves to complete our small circle, both of them radiating the kind of calm confidence that had made them such essential parts of my life. The coordination between all 5 women continued to amaze me. They had transformed what could have been a logistical nightmare into a demonstration of unified purpose that impressed even experienced diplomats. 5 minutes, Serafina announced, her ice-blue eyes reflecting the colorful explosions illuminating the sky above us. Arthur, have you given more thought to the timeline adjustments we discussed? The question referred to conversations we had held over the past few days about potentially modifying our approach to saving Alara. While none of them knew the full details of Isolde's advice, they had all recognized that my initial urgency had given way to more strategic thinking about optimal timing. I confirmed, and I think there might be wisdom in building our position more thoroughly before making our most decisive moves. How much more time are we talking about? Rose asked with the practical focus that characterized her approach to complex planning. Until summer break, I replied, noting how they all immediately understood the implications. By then, the guild's international expansion will be complete. My magical development will have reached peak ascendant rank, and our political influence will be unassailable. That makes sense from a strategic standpoint, Cecilia agreed, though I caught a note of concern in her voice. But it also means several more months of watching Alara remain trapped in that engagement. The reminder of what my strategic patience would cost made my protective instincts flare with familiar intensity. Knowing that Alara would continue suffering while I built my position was almost unbearable, but Isolde's analysis had been uncomfortably convincing about the necessity of proper preparation. 2 minutes, Reika announced softly, moving even closer to my side with the kind of natural intimacy that had characterized our relationship from its beginning. Arthur, whatever timeline we choose, we're all committed to supporting you completely. 1 minute, Rachel said, her voice carrying the kind of serene certainty that had made her legendary as a saintess. And whatever challenges we face in the coming year, we'll face them together. As the countdown to midnight began echoing across the palace grounds and throughout Avalon City, I found myself reflecting on how dramatically my life had changed over the past year. 12 months ago, I had been focused primarily on guild operations and magical development. Now I was positioned at the center of continental politics, romantically involved with 5 extraordinary women, and planning to prevent a war that could destroy everything I cared about. 30 seconds, Cecilia announced, her royal training allowing her to maintain perfect composure even as anticipation built around us. The crowd throughout the palace and across the city began counting down in unison, their voices creating a harmony that seemed to resonate with the magical energies that permeated the capital. 20, 19, 18. I turned to face each of my girlfriends in turn, seeing in their expressions the love, trust, and determination that had made our unlikely arrangement not just possible but genuinely fulfilling. 10, 9, 8, 7. Whatever the new year brings, I said clearly, ensuring they could all hear me above the counting crowd. I promise you this. We will save the Empire from the civil war that threatens it. We will protect everyone we care about. And we will do it together. 3, 2, 1. Happy New Year! As 2048 officially began with explosions of fireworks, magical lighting, and the cheers of thousands of celebrants, I found myself kissing each of my 5 girlfriends in turn. A New Year's tradition that felt both intimate and symbolic of the unity we had achieved. Cecilia first, her lips warm and confident against mine, tasting of the champagne we had shared and carrying the promise of political alliance that had grown into genuine love. Rachel second, her kiss gentle but passionate, conveying the depth of feeling that had survived every challenge we had faced together. Serafina third, her typical restraint giving way to surprising warmth as she expressed emotions that her Kaderi nature usually kept carefully controlled. Rose fourth, her business-like efficiency abandoned in favor of the genuine affection that she rarely allowed others to see. And finally Reka, whose kiss carried the depth of trust and devotion that had made her the foundation of everything else I had built. As we separated and turned to watch the continuing fireworks display, I felt the weight of the promise I had just made settling on my shoulders. 2048 would be the year that determined whether I could successfully prevent the tragedy I knew was coming. Chapter 762. The Courtship War 1. The moment I reached peak ascendant rank, I felt the fundamental shift in my magical capabilities like a symphony finally achieving perfect harmony. Standing in my private training chamber beneath the Ouroboros Guild headquarters, I watched as my mana capacity stabilized at its new threshold, every technique and spell I had mastered over the years now operating with unprecedented precision and power. Excellent, Luna's voice whispered in my mind, carrying a note of satisfaction that I rarely heard from the ancient guardian spirit. You've reached the absolute pinnacle of what's possible before immortal rank. The foundation is now perfectly prepared for what comes next. The power coursing through my body was intoxicating, not just in its raw strength, but in the precision and control it offered. Peak ascendant rank wasn't simply about having more magical energy. It was about having the sophistication to use that energy with surgical precision. Every 7-circle spell, every advanced technique, every application of power could now be calibrated to exactly the effect I desired. But even as I reveled in my advancement, I remained acutely aware of the theoretical framework waiting in my research notes. The Nightingale's Aurora method sat complete and ready, every mathematical equation perfectly balanced, every conceptual framework thoroughly tested. Yet it remained tantalizingly out of reach until I could advance to immortal rank and access the 8-circle magic that would make it possible. Still, peak ascendant rank represented a crucial milestone. The magical advancement was only part of what made this moment significant. Over the 6 months since the New Year's ball, the Ouroboros Guild had completed its expansion into all 5 continents, establishing a network of operations that gave us unprecedented global reach. We weren't just powerful within the Slatemark Empire anymore. We were a genuinely international organization with influence that touched every major economic and political center in the world. Sir, came Elias's voice through the chamber's communication system. The quarterly reports from all continental divisions have arrived. Would you like to review them now? Send them to my office, I replied, making my way out of the training chamber with the kind of confident stride that came from knowing I had finally achieved the position Isolde had insisted I needed, and schedule meetings with the department heads for this afternoon. It's time to discuss our entry into the social season. The elevator ride to my office gave me time to reflect on just how dramatically my position had changed. 6 months ago, I had been a powerful but ultimately regional figure, the guild grandmaster of the Empire's guilds. Today, I commanded economic resources that rivaled treasuries, maintained intelligence networks that spanned continents, and possessed the kind of international connections that made everyone my calls personally. The reports waiting on my desk painted a picture of success that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. The northern continent operations were generating revenue that exceeded the GDP of big families. The eastern branches had established trade relationships that were reshaping entire regional economies. The western and southern expansions had created diplomatic ties that gave the Ouroboros Guild informal influence in continental politics. But it was the technological integration that truly set us apart in this modern world. Our operations centers utilized cutting-edge communication systems that allowed real-time coordination across global distances. Automated logistics networks managed resource distribution with efficiency that governments envied. Advanced magical technological hybrid systems gave our members capabilities that traditional guilds couldn't match. All of which meant that when I decided to enter the Empire's social season as an active participant rather than a peripheral observer, I would be doing so with a level of influence that commanded respect from even the highest levels of power. The Emperor's secretary called this morning. Elias informed me as he entered my office with the day's priority correspondence. His Majesty would like to schedule a private meeting at your earliest convenience. Something about coordinating approaches to the upcoming social events. The fact that Emperor Quinn Slatemark was requesting meetings with me rather than summoning me spoke volumes about how the power dynamics had shifted. While I was still technically weaker than the Emperor in pure magical terms, he was low radiant rank. After all, my economic and political influence had reached a level where he needed to treat me as an equal rather than a subordinate. The same was true for Archduke Leopold and even Archmage Charlotte. My guild's resources and international reach gave me leverage that pure magical power couldn't dismiss. Schedule it for tomorrow afternoon, I decided, and make sure our intelligence network is monitoring Prince Valerian's activities closely. I want to know every social event he'll be attending over the next month. Because today marked the beginning of my campaign to save Alara Astoria from the fate that awaited her in the original timeline. 6 months of strategic preparation had brought me to this point, and I intended to use every advantage I had gained. The social season of the Slatemark Empire was a complex dance of politics, romance, and alliance building that determined relationships for years to come. Young nobles who had recently graduated from their academies would be officially introduced to imperial society, creating opportunities for marriages, business partnerships, and political connections that would shape the next generation of continental leadership. This year's season would be particularly significant because it included several exceptionally powerful and influential young people. Cecilia, Rose, Jack, and Alara had all graduated from their respective academies with distinction, cementing their positions as the most eligible and accomplished of their generation. Their presence at social events would draw attention from across all over the continent. And it was Alara Astoria who occupied my thoughts as I reviewed the season's scheduled events. The woman I had admired as a fictional character and was now determined to save from both an abusive marriage and an early death. Sir, Elias continued, Lady Rose has requested a meeting this afternoon to discuss coordination strategies for the social season. Apparently, the 5 ladies have been developing comprehensive plans for managing the complexities of your unique romantic situation. I had to smile at that. My 5 girlfriends had approached the challenge of navigating high society while maintaining their relationships with me like the strategic operation it truly was. Their coordination had been flawless during the New Year's ball, and I had no doubt they had spent the intervening months developing even more sophisticated approaches to the social complications ahead. Excellent, I replied, and have our intelligence division prepare detailed profiles on all the major social events over the next 2 months. I want to know who will be attending, what the political dynamics are, and where the best opportunities for private conversations might arise. Because my approach to courting Alara would need to be fundamentally different from the typical noble pursuit of marriage alliances. But I also had advantages that neither of them possessed. My transmigrator knowledge gave me insights into Alara's character and preferences that would be impossible to gain through conventional courtship. My economic and political influence provided resources that even a prince might envy. And my genuine desire to protect her, rather than simply possess her, would hopefully distinguish my approach from the entitled demands of royal privilege. The communication panel on my desk chimed with an incoming call from the International Division. "Sir," came the voice of my operations director. "We're receiving reports of increased miasmic activity near several of our overseas facilities. Nothing that threatens operations directly, but the pattern suggests coordinated surveillance rather than random incidents." "Understood," I replied, though the news sent a chill down my spine. The Order of Fallen Flame was clearly still active, and if they were monitoring guild operations, it meant they were tracking my activities more closely than I had hoped. "Increase security protocols at all facilities and start monitoring for any unusual miasmic signatures. I want to know if they're planning something." As the afternoon progressed and I worked through the various administrative details of running a global organization, I found my thoughts repeatedly returning to the woman I was preparing to court. Alara Astoria represented more than just a romantic interest or a person to be saved. She was the key to preventing a civil war that could destroy everything I had built and everyone I cared about. But she was also a living, breathing person with her own dreams, fears, and desires. Whatever approach I took, it would need to respect her agency while still achieving the strategic objectives that could save both her life and the Empire's stability. Looking out the windows of my office at the sprawling city below, I felt the quiet confidence that came from finally being ready for the challenge ahead. Peak ascendant rank magical capabilities, unassailable political influence, and the support of 5 extraordinary women who trusted me completely. It was time to enter the social season and begin the most important courtship campaign of my life. And when I eventually reached immortal rank and could finally use the Nightingale's Aurora method, I would have the power to back up every promise I intended to make. The game for Alara's heart and the Empire's future was about to begin. Chapter 763. The Courtship War, 2. The Springshaper Garden Party was traditionally one of the season's most anticipated events, combining the elegance of high society with the casual atmosphere that encouraged genuine conversation. As I arrived at the Springshaper estate with Cecilia and Rose flanking me in perfectly coordinated formal wear, I felt the familiar thrill of anticipation that came with major social operations. "Remember," Rose murmured as we made our way through the estate's magnificent gardens, "the goal today is to establish your presence as a serious suitor without creating immediate political incidents. We need to be strategic." Cecilia nodded in agreement, her crimson eyes surveying the assembled guests with the analytical precision that made her such an effective crown princess. "My brother will be here, and he'll be expecting you to make a move. The question is how overtly you want to challenge his existing claim." The fact that Rachel, Serafina, and Reika had chosen to step back from the Empire's social scene for now was both strategically wise and personally disappointing. Rachel's obligations as a saintess, Serafina's duties in the Eastern continent, and Reika's preference for avoiding complex political situations meant that Cecilia and Rose would be handling the public coordination of our unconventional arrangement. "There she is," I said quietly, spotting Alara near the estate's famous rose garden, surrounded by the kind of admirers that always gathered around exceptionally beautiful and accomplished young women. She looked absolutely radiant in a flowing white dress that somehow managed to be both elegantly formal and naturally graceful, her golden hair catching the afternoon sunlight in ways that made her appear almost ethereal. But it was the slightly strained quality of her smile that reminded me of the pressure she was under, trapped in an engagement to a man whose true nature she was only beginning to understand. "Arthur," came a voice that immediately set my teeth on edge. "How wonderful to see you here." I turned to see Jack Blazespout approaching with the kind of confident stride that had always characterized his public appearances. Dressed in impeccably tailored formal where that emphasized his natural charisma, he looked every inch the successful young noble that society believed him to be. Only I knew about the demonic flames that lurked beneath that charming exterior. Jack, I replied with diplomatic neutrality, though every instinct I possessed was screaming warnings. I wasn't expecting to see you at a garden party. This hardly seems like your usual type of event. Jack's smile was perfectly pleasant, but I caught the cold calculation in his eyes that confirmed we both understood exactly what game we were playing. He knew that I knew his true identity as the future Third Calamity. I knew that he knew I was aware of his connection to the Order of Fallen Flame. The mutual knowledge created a tension that made every interaction feel like a duel fought with polite conversation. Oh, but I've recently developed an appreciation for gardens, Jack replied with emphasis that left no doubt about his meaning. Particularly rare and beautiful flowers that require careful cultivation. The metaphor was about as subtle as a sword through the chest. Jack wasn't just here for social reasons, he was here to pursue Alara. But why? In the original timeline, he had shown no romantic interest in her whatsoever. His focus had been entirely on accumulating power and eliminating obstacles to his ambitions. How interesting, I said carefully. I wouldn't have thought you'd have time for such delicate pursuits, given your other interests. People change, Jack replied with the kind of meaningful look that suggested layers of planning I hadn't anticipated. Sometimes we discover that what we thought we wanted isn't nearly as valuable as what we never knew we needed. Before I could respond to that cryptic comment, another voice cut through our tense conversation with the kind of royal authority that commanded immediate attention. Gentlemen, came Prince Valerian's smooth tones as he approached our small group with obvious confidence. I hope you're both enjoying the garden party. Though I must say, some of the most beautiful flowers are already spoken for. Where Jack's approach had been subtle manipulation wrapped in polite conversation, Valerian's was pure aristocratic charm backed by undeniable royal privilege. He moved with the natural grace that came from a lifetime of court training, his handsome features arranged in the kind of smile that had made him legendary among the Empire's social elite. The contrast between his public persona and the psychological abuser I knew him to be was jarring. In social settings like this, Valerian was genuinely charismatic, witty, charming, and possessed of the kind of effortless confidence that drew people to him like moths to flame. It was only in private that his true nature emerged. Your Highness, Jack replied with perfect diplomatic respect, though I noticed how his eyes never left Valerian's face. Indeed, though one might argue that the most beautiful flowers deserve the freedom to choose their own garden. An interesting perspective, Valerian said with obvious amusement. Though I believe most flowers prefer the security of established gardens rather than the uncertainty of experimental arrangements. The verbal sparring was becoming increasingly pointed, and I realized that both men were treating this as a public demonstration of their respective positions. Jack was positioning himself as the alternative to royal tradition, while Valerian was asserting the strength of existing claims. Perhaps, I interjected, deciding it was time to make my own position clear. The flowers' preferences should be the primary consideration. After all, the most beautiful gardens are those where everything grows naturally rather than being forced into predetermined patterns. Both men turned to look at me with expressions that mixed surprise with calculation. Jack's eyes narrowed slightly, as if he was reassessing something he had previously dismissed. Valerian's charming smile gained a harder edge that suggested I had just declared myself a more serious threat than he had anticipated. Grandmaster Nightingale, Valerian said with the kind of polite formality that barely concealed his irritation. How noble of you to concern yourself with gardening. Though I wonder if someone with such extensive international responsibilities has the time for such delicate cultivation. Oh, I always make time for things that truly matter, I replied, meeting his gaze directly. And I've found that the most valuable investments are often those that require the most careful attention. The tension between the three of us was becoming palpable, and I noticed several nearby guests beginning to take subtle notice of our conversation. Cecilia and Rose had positioned themselves strategically to observe without appearing to eavesdrop, their expressions carefully neutral despite what I knew must be intense curiosity about the dynamics at play. Fascinating, Jack said with obvious amusement at the developing situation. It seems Lady Alara has attracted quite a diverse group of admirers. I wonder what she thinks of all this attention. As if summoned by our conversation, Alara herself approached our small group with the kind of graceful confidence that had made her the moral center of the original novel. Up close, I could see the intelligence in her gentle violet eyes, the subtle strength in her bearing that suggested she was far more aware of the undercurrents around her than most people realized. "Gentlemen," she said with polite warmth, "I hope you're all enjoying the garden party. The Spring Shaper roses are particularly beautiful this year." "Not nearly as beautiful as the company," Valerian replied smoothly, moving to position himself beside her with the kind of proprietary gesture that made my protective instincts flare. "Lady Alara, might I have the honor of showing you the estate's famous moonflower garden? It's supposed to be particularly spectacular this time of day." "That sounds lovely," Alara replied, though I caught a flicker of something that might have been reluctance in her expression. "Though perhaps a group tour would be more appropriate? I'm sure everyone would enjoy seeing them." "Actually," Jack interjected with perfectly calculated timing, "I was hoping to discuss some mutual acquaintances with Lady Alara. Perhaps we could arrange a more private conversation later." "And I added, refusing to be left out of this increasingly complex courtship dance, "would be honored to continue our conversation from the New Year's ball. There were several topics we didn't have time to explore fully." The reminder of our dance months earlier brought a genuine smile to Alara's face, the first truly warm expression I had seen from her all afternoon. "I remember," she said softly. "That was one of the most interesting conversations I've had in quite some time." The impact of her words on both Valerian and Jack was immediate and obvious. Valerian's charming mask slipped slightly, revealing a flash of possessive anger that he quickly suppressed. Jack's eyes narrowed as he realized that my relationship with Alara might be more advanced than he had anticipated. "Well then," Valerian said with forced joviality, "it seems we all have reasons to seek Lady Alara's company. Perhaps we should let the lady herself decide how she'd like to spend the remainder of the afternoon." All three of us turned to look at Alara, who seemed to realize that she had suddenly become the center of a very public courtship competition. Chapter 764. The Courtship War, 3. Standing in the Spring Shaper Gardens with three very different men waiting for my response, I felt the familiar sensation of being caught between forces far larger than myself. This wasn't just about choosing who to spend an afternoon with. Everyone present understood that my decision would signal something significant about my preferences and potentially reshape the entire social dynamic surrounding the potential engagement that had been discussed. Between my family and the royal house, I looked at each of them in turn, trying to process the complex emotions their presence stirred within me. Prince Valerian stood with the confident bearing that had always characterized his public appearances, his handsome features arranged in that charming smile that had made him legendary among the empire's social elite. He was everything a prince should be: powerful, charismatic, politically astute. Yet something about the way he positioned himself beside me, as if my acceptance of his invitation was a foregone conclusion, made me feel more like a possession than a person being courted. Jack Blaispout radiated a different kind of appeal entirely. Where Valerian commanded through royal authority, Jack charmed through genuine charisma and the hint of exciting danger that always seemed to surround him. His dark eyes held an intensity that was both thrilling and slightly unsettling, as if he saw things in me that I didn't even know existed. But there was something about his smile that never quite reached his eyes, a calculation behind his charm that my instincts warned me to be cautious about. And then there was Arthur Nightingale. The Guild Grandmaster stood with quiet confidence that didn't need to prove itself through displays of power or charm. Where the others had positioned themselves to subtly claim territory, Arthur simply waited for my decision with the kind of patience that suggested he genuinely cared about my preferences rather than his own strategic objectives. His blue eyes held warmth and intelligence, but more importantly, they held respect, for me as a person rather than as a prize to be won. "I think," I said carefully, aware that everyone within earshot was listening to my words, "I would enjoy continuing that conversation from the New Year's ball. Grandmaster Nightingale, would you care to show me the estate's herb gardens?" I've heard they have some fascinating medicinal varieties. The relief in Arthur's expression was immediate and genuine, while the reactions from Valerian and Jack were telling in their own ways. Valerian's charming mask slipped just enough to reveal a flash of possessive irritation before he recovered his composure. Jack's eyes narrowed slightly, as if he was recalculating something he had previously taken for granted. "Of course, Lady Alara," Arthur replied with obvious pleasure. "I'd be honored." As we walked away from the group toward the more secluded section of the gardens where the Springshaper family cultivated their famous medicinal herbs, I felt some of the tension leaving my shoulders. There was something about Arthur's presence that made me feel genuinely comfortable in a way that I rarely experienced in formal social settings. "Thank you," I said quietly once we were out of immediate earshot of the other guests. "For what?" Arthur asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "For not assuming my answer," I replied honestly. "For actually waiting to hear what I wanted rather than simply expecting me to comply with your wishes." Arthur stopped walking and turned to face me fully, his expression serious despite the gentle smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Alara, may I be completely honest with you about something?" The use of my first name was bold for someone I had met formally only once before, but somehow it felt natural rather than presumptuous. "Please do." "I have no interest in courting someone who doesn't want to be courted," he said simply. "Whatever develops between us, friendship, something more, or nothing at all, it has to be because you choose it freely. Not because of political pressure, social expectations, or anyone else's agenda." The sincerity in his voice made something warm unfurl in my chest. When was the last time someone had spoken to me about my own choices as if they actually mattered? "That's refreshing," I admitted, then found myself adding more candidly than I usually spoke to relative strangers. "Most people seem to assume they know what's best for me without ever asking what I actually want." "And what do you want?" Arthur asked, his tone making it clear that he was asking about far more than just our afternoon plans. The question caught me off guard because it was so rare for anyone to ask it seriously. I found myself considering not just the polite answer I was supposed to give, but what I actually felt. "I want to matter," I said finally, surprised by my own honesty. "Not as a political alliance or a social trophy or a way to achieve someone else's goals. I want to be seen as myself, for who I actually am rather than who people think I should be." Arthur's expression grew thoughtful as we continued walking through the herb gardens, the fragrant scent of medicinal plants creating a peaceful atmosphere that encouraged genuine conversation. "Tell me about yourself, then," he said. "Not Lady Alara Astoria, daughter of the Archduke. Just Alara. What do you care about? What makes you happy? What keeps you awake at night thinking?" The questions were so different from the usual social pleasantries that I found myself actually pausing to consider them seriously. When was the last time someone had asked me about my thoughts rather than my opinions on acceptable social topics? "I care about healing," I said slowly, thinking through my response. Not just the magical healing that everyone expects from someone with my abilities, but understanding why people hurt each other and how to prevent that pain in the first place. I spend a lot of time thinking about how much suffering could be avoided if people just listened to each other more. "That's remarkably wise for someone who's supposedly naive," Arthur observed with obvious respect. "People mistake kindness for ignorance," I replied, feeling more comfortable than I had in months. "They assume that because I prefer to see the best in people, I'm blind to their flaws. But understanding someone's potential for goodness doesn't mean ignoring their capacity for harm." Arthur stopped walking and turned to study my face with an intensity that would have been unsettling from anyone else. From him, it felt like being truly seen for the first time in years. "You're not at all what I expected," he said quietly. "What did you expect?" I asked, genuinely curious about his answer. "Someone more fragile, I suppose. Your reputation focuses so much on your gentleness and purity that I thought you might be sheltered to the point of helplessness. But you're not fragile at all, are you? You're strong in ways that most people don't even recognize as strength." The accurate assessment made my chest tighten with emotion I wasn't prepared for. No one has ever described me that way before. "Then they haven't been paying attention," Arthur replied with such conviction that I found myself believing him. We settled on a bench near a particularly beautiful section of the herb garden, where the afternoon sunlight filtered through carefully cultivated flowering vines to create a sense of peaceful seclusion. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt genuinely relaxed in the company of someone outside my immediate family. "May I ask you something?" I said, emboldened by the easy atmosphere between us. "Anything," Arthur replied without hesitation. "Why are you interested in me?" The question came out more vulnerably than I had intended, but I found I genuinely wanted to know. "You could court anyone. You're powerful, accomplished, internationally respected. You don't need a political alliance with my family. So why?" "Because," Arthur said with the same careful honesty he had shown throughout our conversation, "you're the most genuinely good person I've ever met. Not perfect, no one is, but fundamentally decent in a way that's rare in our world. And because when I look at you, I don't see a political opportunity or a social prize. I see someone worth knowing for her own sake." The warmth spreading through my chest at his words was both wonderful and terrifying. I had never felt anything quite like it before. This combination of safety and excitement, comfort and possibility. "Arthur?" I said softly, testing how his name felt on my lips. "I should warn you about something." "What?" he asked, though his tone suggested he was prepared to hear almost anything. "There have been discussions about a potential engagement between my family and Prince Valerian," I said, the words feeling heavy and constraining. "It's not finalized, but the political pressure is significant. Whatever this is between us, it can't be simple." "I know," Arthur replied quietly, "and I want you to know that I understand the complications. But Alara, I also want you to know that you deserve to have a choice in your own future. You deserve better than being trapped in arrangements that don't consider your happiness." The gentle conviction in his voice made something inside me recognize a truth I had been trying to ignore for months. I did deserve a choice. I deserved to be considered as more than just a political alliance. I deserved to have my feelings matter in decisions about my own life. "Thank you," I whispered, meaning it more deeply than he could possibly know. "For what this time?" Arthur asked with gentle humor. "For seeing me," I replied simply. "For the first time in my life, I feel like someone actually sees me." As we sat together in the peaceful garden, I found myself thinking that whatever complications lay ahead, this moment of genuine connection was worth treasuring. Arthur Nightingale might not be able to offer me the simple life I had once imagined, but he was offering something far more precious, the chance to be myself without apology. For now, that was enough. Chapter 765. The Courtship War. 4. Returning from the herb gardens with Alara at my side, I felt a satisfaction that went far beyond simple strategic success. The genuine connection we had established during our conversation was something I hadn't anticipated. I had expected to need weeks of careful courtship to achieve the kind of comfortable rapport that had developed naturally between us in a single afternoon. But as we rejoined the main gathering at the Springshaper Garden Party, I immediately noticed Jack Blazespout standing near the estate's famous fountain, his expression darker than I had ever seen it in public. His usual charming mask had slipped enough to reveal something that looked remarkably like frustration, though he quickly composed himself as he noticed our approach. Typical, I thought to myself, studying Jack's reaction with familiar irritation. He can't stand that I'm succeeding where he expected to have a clear field. Jack had always been the type to insert himself into any situation where he might gain advantage or simply cause problems for his rivals. His interest in Alara was clearly motivated by his desire to interfere with my plans, the same petty competitiveness that had characterized our relationship since we'd first encountered each other. The fact that I was making genuine progress in winning Alara's trust was obviously grating on his nerves. "Grandmaster Nightingale," Jack said as we approached, his voice carrying its usual polite warmth despite the tension I had glimpsed moments earlier. "I trust you and Lady Alara had an enlightening conversation?" "Very much so," I replied carefully, noting how his eyes tracked every detail of Alara's expression and posture. "The Springshaper herb gardens are truly remarkable. Lady Alara has an impressive knowledge of medicinal applications. I'm sure she does, Jack replied, though something in his tone suggested he was thinking about far more than botanical expertise. Lady Alara, I don't suppose I could interest you in viewing the estate's conservatory? I understand they have some rare specimens that might interest someone with your healing inclinations. The emphasis he placed on healing carried undertones that made my protective instincts flare with sudden intensity. Jack was clearly trying to capitalize on the rapport I had established with Alara, attempting to redirect her attention toward himself through similar appeals to her interests. It was exactly the kind of opportunistic behavior I had come to expect from him. That sounds fascinating, Alara replied with the kind of genuine enthusiasm that had characterized her throughout our own conversation. Though perhaps we could arrange that for another time? I promised my father I would make rounds to greet all the major families present today. The diplomatic deflection was handled with the kind of graceful skill that reminded me why Alara commanded such respect throughout the empire. She managed to decline Jack's invitation without giving offense while providing a perfectly reasonable excuse that no one could argue with. Of course, Jack said with what appeared to be gracious understanding, though I caught a flash of something much darker in his eyes before he controlled his expression. Family obligations must always take precedence. As we moved away from Jack to continue circulating through the garden party, I found myself analyzing his behavior with growing annoyance. The intensity of his reaction confirmed that he was taking my competition for Alara's attention as a personal challenge rather than simply a political necessity. If Jack was determined to interfere with my mission out of nothing more than spite, it could complicate everything I was trying to achieve. The rest of the afternoon proceeded with the kind of sophisticated social interaction that characterized the Empire's finest gatherings. Alara moved through the assembled guests with natural grace, engaging in conversations that revealed her genuine interest in the people around her, rather than simply performing the social obligations expected of someone in her position. "You're remarkably good at this," I observed as we paused near the estate's famous rose garden, watching her skillfully navigate a complex conversation between two minor nobles who had been feuding over trade agreements. "At what?" Alara asked with genuine curiosity. "Reading people," I replied, noting how she had managed to identify the root of their disagreement and guide them toward common ground without either man realizing they were being diplomatically managed. "You see past the surface tensions to what people actually need. It's not that difficult," Alara said with the kind of modest smile that suggested she genuinely didn't recognize how unusual her abilities were. "Most conflicts happen because people aren't really listening to each other. They're so focused on being right that they forget to understand what the other person is actually trying to say." The insight was both simple and profound, the kind of wisdom that came from genuine empathy rather than formal training. Watching her apply these principles in real time was impressive in ways that had nothing to do with romantic attraction and everything to do with recognizing exceptional competence. "Have you considered applying that approach to larger-scale diplomatic situations?" I asked, curious about her broader ambitions. "Your insights could be valuable in preventing conflicts before they escalate." "I've discussed it with my father," Alara admitted, her expression growing more thoughtful. "He's incredibly supportive of my interests, though he worries about the practical challenges. He says the current political climate might not be ready for some of my more innovative approaches to conflict resolution." The careful way she phrased her response told me that Archduke Leopold was clearly supportive of his daughter's intellectual pursuits while being protective about the potential obstacles she might face. A loving father who recognized her capabilities but was concerned about how a hostile political environment might treat someone with her idealistic vision. "He wants me to develop my ideas further before presenting them publicly," Alara continued with obvious affection for her father's guidance. "Papa believes in giving me the time and resources to build a solid foundation for my theories, rather than rushing into situations where I might face unnecessary criticism." Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Prince Valerian, who approached with the kind of confident stride that had always characterized his public appearances. Dressed in formal where that emphasized his royal status, he looked every inch the prince that society expected him to be. "Lady Alara," Valerian said with the charming smile that had made him legendary among the Empire's social elite, I've been looking forward to speaking with you. Might I have the honor of your company for a few minutes? Of course, Your Highness, Elara replied with the kind of polite compliance that had been trained into her since childhood, though I noticed how she glanced briefly at me as if hoping for some excuse to decline. Actually, I interjected before Valerian could lead her away. Lady Elara was just sharing some fascinating insights about conflict resolution. Your Highness might find her perspectives interesting, given their potential applications to governance. The suggestion was calculated to keep their conversation in a group setting rather than allowing Valerian the private audience he clearly wanted. Elara's relieved expression confirmed that she appreciated the intervention, even if she couldn't express that appreciation directly. Indeed, Valerian replied with forced enthusiasm, clearly recognizing that he had been outmaneuvered. Though I'm sure Lady Elara's insights deserve more focused discussion than a garden party allows. The rest of the evening proceeded with similar dynamics. Valerian attempting to claim private time with Elara, Jack trying to engage her in conversations that would demonstrate his intellectual sophistication, and me working to maintain the kind of respectful interaction that distinguished my approach from both of theirs. What struck me throughout the evening was how naturally Elara and I seemed to communicate. Not romantically, this was still fundamentally about completing my mission, but with the kind of easy rapport that made conversation genuinely enjoyable rather than strategically necessary. "Thank you," Elara said quietly as the garden party began to wind down and guests started making their departures. "For what?" I asked, though I suspected I knew what she meant. "For treating me like a person rather than a political objective," she replied with more honesty than the public setting would normally allow. "For being interested in what I think rather than just what I represent." The gratitude in her voice reinforced my conviction that this mission was about more than preventing a civil war. Elara Astoria deserved better than being reduced to a political asset by the people around her, and if my courtship could provide her with at least one relationship based on genuine respect, then that was worthwhile regardless of the broader strategic objectives. Chapter 766. The Courtship War, 5. The invitation arrived on elegant cream paper that carried the subtle scent of medicinal herbs, its informal tone a marked contrast to the formal social correspondence I had grown accustomed to receiving from noble families. Lady Elara Astoria requested the honor of my presence for an afternoon discussion of botanical applications at her family's private greenhouse, suggesting that our conversation at the Springshaper garden party had sparked her interest in potential collaboration. "Interesting development," Rose observed as she reviewed the morning's correspondence alongside me in my private office. "Personal invitations to family properties suggest a level of trust that goes beyond casual social acquaintance." "Or," I replied with careful neutrality that didn't quite hide my growing anticipation, "she's genuinely interested in the magical therapy applications we discussed. Elara strikes me as someone who pursues knowledge for its own sake rather than social positioning." Rose's brown eyes studied my expression with the analytical precision that had made her such an effective business partner. "Arthur, when was the last time you looked forward to a meeting for purely intellectual reasons?" The question caught me off guard because it forced me to examine motivations I hadn't fully acknowledged. My interest in spending time with Elara was becoming less strategic and more personal with each interaction, though I wasn't entirely certain when that shift had occurred. "Point taken," I admitted, gathering the reports I had prepared on the Guild's research into magical therapy techniques. Though I maintain that her insights about holistic healing approaches have genuine practical value. "Of course they do," Rose agreed with obvious amusement at my defensive tone. "Just remember that the most dangerous political alliances are the ones that feel personal rather than strategic." The Astoria family's private greenhouse was a marvel of magical architecture that demonstrated both their wealth and their serious commitment to healing arts. The structure itself was constructed from crystal panels that could filter and enhance different types of therapeutic energy, while the climate control systems maintained perfect growing conditions for hundreds of rare medicinal plants from across all 5 continents. "Arthur?" Elara greeted me as I entered the main cultivation chamber, her voice carrying warmth that made my chest tighten with unexpected pleasure. "Thank you for accepting my invitation. I hope you don't mind the informal setting. This is where I do my best thinking." She wore a simple but elegant dress in pale green that complemented both the greenhouse environment and her golden hair, while her hands showed the subtle stains that came from working directly with magical plants rather than merely observing them. The sight of someone from such a distinguished noble family engaging in hands-on research struck me as both admirable and slightly surprising. "Not at all," I replied, studying the impressive array of specimens that surrounded us. "This collection is remarkable. Some of these varieties I've only seen in theoretical texts. Papa has been incredibly supportive of my interests," Alara said with obvious affection as she gestured for me to follow her deeper into the greenhouse. He arranged trading relationships with botanical experts from every continent to ensure I could study the full range of healing applications. We walked through sections dedicated to different therapeutic approaches: pain management herbs from the northern mountains, emotional balancing flowers from eastern gardens, trauma recovery roots from southern forests. Each area was carefully maintained according to the specific needs of its plants, creating microenvironments that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of magical cultivation principles. "There's something specific I wanted to show you," Alara continued, leading me toward a more secluded section where the lighting was softer and the magical atmosphere carried undertones that spoke to experimental rather than established techniques. "I've been working on developing new approaches to treating emotional wounds, the kind of trauma that conventional healing magic can't address." The plants in this section were unlike anything I had encountered before. Some seemed to pulse with gentle light that synchronized with their observers' heartbeats, while others emanated subtle fragrances that created feelings of safety and calm. The magical theory behind such applications was complex enough to impress me despite my own advanced training. "The basic principle," Alara explained as she guided me to examine a flowering vine whose blooms shifted color in response to emotional states, "is that most trauma creates patterns of fear and mistrust that prevent natural healing. These plants help restore the emotional foundation necessary for recovery." "Fascinating," I said with genuine admiration, studying the delicate flowers that seemed to respond to my presence by shifting toward warmer hues. The applications for treating magical exhaustion and combat stress could be revolutionary. "Exactly." Alara's face lit up with enthusiasm that transformed her from merely beautiful to genuinely captivating. "Most healers focus on repairing physical damage without addressing why the damage occurred in the first place. But if you can help someone feel safe enough to trust again, to hope again, the body's natural healing accelerates dramatically." We spent the next hour examining her experimental cultivation techniques, discussing theoretical applications, and exploring how such approaches might be integrated with conventional magical therapy. What struck me most was how Alara's gentle nature concealed a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and magical theory that rivaled anything I had encountered in formal academic settings. "Arthur," she said as we settled on a bench surrounded by flowering plants that filled the air with subtle therapeutic energies, "may I ask you something personal?" "Of course," I replied, though something in her tone suggested this conversation was about to shift from professional collaboration to more intimate territory. "Your reputation suggests you're driven by the need to become powerful enough to protect everyone around you," she said with the kind of gentle directness that made evasion feel impossible. "But who protects you?" The question hit me like a physical blow because it touched on fears I had never articulated to anyone, including myself. The weight of responsibility I carried for the guild, for my relationships, for the political stability that affected millions of people. All of it rested on my ability to remain strong enough to handle whatever challenges emerged. "I protect myself," I said finally, though the words felt inadequate even as I spoke them. "Through training, through preparation, through building sufficient power to handle threats before they become critical." "That's not what I meant," Alara replied with quiet persistence that suggested she wouldn't be deflected by surface answers. "Physical protection, magical protection, yes, you've certainly achieved those. But emotional protection, who do you trust enough to be vulnerable with?" The silence stretched between us while I grappled with a question that challenged assumptions I had never examined. My relationships with the other women in my life were built on mutual support and shared strength, but they also carried expectations about my competence and leadership that made complete vulnerability feel impossible. "I don't know," I admitted with honesty that surprised me. I've never really thought about it that way. Everyone needs someone who can see them without their armor, Alara said softly, her violet eyes holding understanding that made my chest tighten with unfamiliar emotion. Someone who cares about their well-being rather than just their capabilities. And you? I asked, deflecting attention from my own emotional defenses. Who sees you without your armor? Alara's expression grew thoughtful as she considered the question with obvious seriousness. Papa, certainly. He's never treated me as just another noble daughter to be married off for political advantage. But beyond family. She paused, her cheeks coloring slightly. I'm realizing that most people see Lady Alara Astoria, the Archduke's daughter with healing abilities. Not many people are interested in what I actually think or feel about things. I am, I said with conviction that surprised us both. Interested, in what you think and feel. Not because of your title or your abilities, but because your perspective is genuinely valuable. The admission hung between us like a bridge across the careful distance we had been maintaining, creating possibilities that felt both thrilling and terrifying. Alara's response was a smile that carried warmth reaching beyond mere politeness or social courtesy. Thank you, she said quietly. That means more to me than you probably realize. We continued talking as the afternoon light shifted through the greenhouse's crystal panels, our conversation meandering from magical theory to personal philosophy to shared observations about the complexities of noble life. What struck me most was how natural it felt. Not the careful diplomatic exchange that characterized most of my social interactions, but genuine communication between two people who were discovering unexpected compatibility. Arthur, Alara said as the day began drawing toward evening, I have a confession to make. Oh, I replied, though something in her tone made my pulse quicken with anticipation. This invitation wasn't entirely about botanical collaboration, she admitted with the kind of honest vulnerability that made my protective instincts flare. I wanted to spend time with you away from the social performance that characterizes most noble gatherings. I wanted to see who you are when you don't have to be the guild grandmaster or the political strategist or the powerful mage everyone expects you to be. And what did you discover? I asked, though I wasn't entirely certain I was prepared for her answer. Someone worth knowing, Alara replied with simple directness that made my heart race. Someone whose genuine concern for others' well-being is more attractive than all his power and influence combined. The moment stretched between us filled with possibility and growing awareness that what was developing between us transcended the strategic considerations that had initially motivated my courtship. This remarkable woman was choosing to see past my public persona to appreciate qualities I had never considered particularly noteworthy. Alara, I said carefully, I should be honest about something as well. Please do, she replied with encouraging warmth. When I first sought your company, it was for strategic reasons, I admitted, watching her expression carefully for signs of disappointment or withdrawal. But somewhere along the way that changed. Now I find myself looking forward to seeing you for entirely personal reasons that have nothing to do with politics or alliances. Her smile in response was radiant enough to make the therapeutic plants around us seem to bloom more vibrantly. I hoped that might be the case, she said softly, because I've been looking forward to seeing you for the same personal reasons. As I prepared to leave the greenhouse sanctuary where we had shared our first truly intimate conversation, I found myself understanding something that had previously remained theoretical. The most powerful alliances weren't built on strategic calculation or mutual advantage. They were built on genuine care between people who chose to see each other clearly and appreciate what they found. Walking back toward the guild headquarters as the sun set over Avalon City, I realized that Lady Alara Astoria had accomplished something no amount of political maneuvering or magical training had achieved. She had made me want to be worthy of her trust for reasons that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with the man I could become in her presence. Chapter 767. The Courtship War. 6. The Imperial Museum's quarterly exhibition opening had drawn the finest minds in the Empire for an evening that combined cultural appreciation with the kind of sophisticated networking that shaped policy and social trends. As I arrived with Cecilia and Rose, both looking radiant in coordinated formal wear that subtly reinforced our political alliance, I felt the familiar anticipation that came with major social operations. The medieval magical artifacts collection should provide excellent conversation topics, Rose observed as we made our way through the museum's grand entrance hall. Alara mentioned having strong opinions about the ethical implications of displaying items that were created through questionable methods. Perfect, I replied, appreciating how my girlfriends continued to provide strategic intelligence that made these events more productive. That's exactly the kind of substantial discussion that distinguishes my approach from the competition. Cecilia's crimson eyes sparkled with amusement. Speaking of competition, I see both your rivals have arrived early. They seem to be positioning themselves strategically. Indeed, Prince Valerian had claimed a prominent position near the exhibition's centerpiece, a display of royal artifacts that naturally drew attention to his own status and heritage. His approach to the museum opening was typical of his overall strategy. Demonstrate his position at the center of the empire's cultural and political elite while subtly reinforcing his claim to everything he considered rightfully his. Jack, meanwhile, had positioned himself near the more intellectually challenging displays, engaging visitors in sophisticated discussions about historical context and cultural significance. I recognized his tactics immediately. Establish himself as intellectually serious and culturally sophisticated while maintaining that aura of mysterious charisma that some people found attractive. Predictable, I muttered, studying both men with the analytical precision that had served me well in both business and strategic planning. Arthur, came Alara's voice from behind me, warm with genuine pleasure at our encounter. I was hoping you would attend tonight. The exhibition has some fascinating pieces that relate to our previous conversations about healing applications. She looked absolutely lovely in a sophisticated dress that managed to be both elegantly formal and uniquely suited to her personality, but it was the genuine enthusiasm in her expression that struck me most. Unlike the carefully controlled pleasantness she displayed with most social acquaintances, her interactions with me had developed a quality of natural ease that made our conversations genuinely enjoyable. I wouldn't miss it, I replied honestly, especially when you've recommended specific pieces worth examining. Your insights about historical healing methods have been remarkably thought-provoking. Oh, you must see the Meridian Dynasty collection, Alara said with obvious excitement, gesturing toward a section of the exhibition that featured magical medical instruments from several centuries earlier. The integration of artistic beauty with practical function is extraordinary. But what's really fascinating is how their approach to treating trauma was so much more sophisticated than current methods. As we made our way toward the historical medical collection, I found myself genuinely impressed by the depth of Alara's knowledge. This wasn't casual interest or polite social conversation. She had clearly studied these artifacts extensively and developed informed opinions about their broader implications. Look at this diagnostic amulet, she continued, pointing to an intricately carved pendant that still hummed with residual magical energy. It could identify not just physical ailments but emotional and spiritual imbalances that contributed to illness. Imagine if we could recreate that kind of holistic approach with modern magical techniques. The applications could be revolutionary. I agreed, studying the artifact with new appreciation, both for individual healing and for understanding social problems on a larger scale. Exactly. Alara's face lit up with the kind of intellectual excitement that transformed her from merely beautiful to genuinely captivating. If we could identify the root causes of societal discord the way this amulet identified the sources of individual suffering. Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jack, who approached with his usual confident stride and that charming smile that I had learned to distrust completely. Lady Alara, Jack said with obvious pleasure at encountering us. I couldn't help but overhear your discussion about holistic healing approaches. Have you considered the philosophical implications of attempting to heal discord that might serve necessary evolutionary functions? The question was phrased as intellectual curiosity, but I recognized it as Jack's typical strategy of introducing complicated ideas designed to make him appear sophisticated while subtly undermining whatever topic Alara was enthusiastic about. An interesting perspective, Alara replied thoughtfully, though I would argue that growth and evolution can occur through positive challenge rather than destructive conflict. The goal isn't to eliminate all discord, but to transform harmful patterns into constructive ones. Remarkably optimistic, Jack observed, his eyes never leaving Alara's face as she spoke. Though one wonders whether such an approach is practical when dealing with forces that are fundamentally opposed to harmony. I watched this exchange with growing irritation, recognizing Jack's technique of posing as the worldly realist challenging Alara's supposedly naive idealism. What bothered me wasn't just the manipulation, but the way he seemed to study her responses with such intense focus, as if cataloging information for future use. Perhaps, I interjected, the question isn't whether harmony is practical, but whether the alternatives are acceptable. If we assume that destructive conflict is inevitable, we eliminate the possibility of finding better solutions. Jack's attention shifted to me with obvious calculation. The Grandmaster raises an important point about assumptions and possibilities. Though one might argue that understanding darker realities is necessary for developing effective responses to them. The conversation continued in this vein for several minutes, with Jack continuing his pattern of intellectual sparring that I now recognized as deliberate interference with any meaningful connection between Alara and myself. Every topic she raised, he would complicate with supposedly sophisticated objections. Every insight she offered, he would challenge with alternative perspectives that sounded thoughtful but were clearly designed to disrupt rather than enhance the discussion. What struck me most was Alara's patient grace in handling his interruptions. She engaged with his ideas seriously despite their obvious manipulative purpose, demonstrating the kind of intellectual generosity that made her worthy of far better treatment than she was receiving. "Gentlemen," came Prince Valerian's smooth voice as he joined our group near the historical medical collection. "I hope you're all finding the exhibition educational, though I must say, some of the most beautiful artifacts deserve to be appreciated for their aesthetic value rather than being analyzed for purely practical applications." Where Jack's approach was intellectual manipulation, Valerian's was pure aristocratic dismissal. His comment was clearly directed at Alara's enthusiasm for the healing applications of historical artifacts, reducing her scholarly interests to mere practical concerns beneath the notice of properly cultured people. "I disagree, Your Highness," Alara replied with polite firmness. "Beauty and function aren't mutually exclusive. These artifacts are remarkable precisely because they achieved both aesthetic excellence and healing effectiveness." "Of course," Valerian said with the kind of condescending smile that suggested he was humoring a child's innocent interests. "Though perhaps such technical details are better left to scholars and healers, while those of us in positions of responsibility focus on broader cultural appreciation." The casual dismissal of Alara's intellectual capabilities made my protective instincts flare with immediate intensity. Valerian wasn't just disagreeing with her perspective. He was suggesting that her interests were inappropriate for someone of her social status, attempting to shame her into conforming to his narrow expectations of proper feminine behavior. "Actually," I said with careful emphasis, "Lady Alara's analysis demonstrates exactly the kind of innovative thinking that could revolutionize both healing arts and social policy. Her insights deserve serious consideration from anyone interested in genuine progress rather than superficial cultural posturing." The public correction was deliberate and unmistakable, a direct challenge to Valerian's attempt to diminish Alara's intellectual contributions. The prince's charming mask slipped slightly, revealing a flash of genuine irritation before he managed to reassert his composure. "Naturally," Valerian replied with forced politeness, "the Grandmaster's appreciation for diverse perspectives is well known, though some of us prefer to maintain traditional standards of discourse appropriate to refined society." The remainder of the evening proceeded with similar dynamics, but the fundamental tension had been established. Valerian's increasingly possessive attitude toward Alara was becoming more obvious, while Jack's pattern of intellectual interference continued to disrupt every meaningful conversation. And I found myself genuinely enjoying Alara's company in ways that had nothing to do with my mission and everything to do with her remarkable intelligence and kindness. "Thank you," Alara said quietly as we paused near the exhibition's concluding display, "for taking my ideas seriously, for understanding that beauty and function can enhance each other rather than being mutually exclusive." "Your ideas deserve serious consideration," I replied honestly. Anyone who dismisses them is missing the opportunity to learn from someone with genuine wisdom. The grateful smile she gave me was worth every moment of social maneuvering required to earn it. This remarkable woman was being systematically undervalued by the people around her, and if my presence in her life could provide some relief from that dismissive treatment, then the mission was achieving more than just strategic objectives. As the museum opening concluded and guests began to depart, I found myself looking forward to whatever event would bring us together next. Not because I was falling in love, but because Elara Astoria was proving to be exactly the kind of person who made the world better simply by being in it. The mission continued, and it was becoming increasingly clear that success would require not just preventing her tragic fate, but ensuring she had the opportunity to reach her full potential. Chapter 768. The Courtship War, 7. The emergency alert reached me through multiple channels simultaneously, priority messages flashing across my personal tablet, urgent notifications through my Neuralink communication implant, and even backup audio warnings through the office's environmental systems. Elias had activated every available protocol to ensure the message penetrated my exhaustion-induced tunnel vision after 46 hours of continuous research. "Sir," Elias's voice came through the intercom with professional concern that carried undertones of genuine alarm. "Lady Elara Astoria is at the Guild headquarters requesting immediate access to your location. She's expressing significant concern about your well-being. And frankly, sir, her worry appears well-founded." The statement penetrated my exhaustion with the force of genuine alarm. Elara's presence at the Guild at 3 in the morning suggested either emergency or crisis, neither of which I was equipped to handle in my current depleted state. My biometric monitors were displaying warning indicators that I had been ignoring for hours, while my magical system diagnostics showed dangerous levels of sustained overdraw. "Grant her access," I replied through the voice-activated interface, attempting to inject alertness into my response despite feeling like my neural pathways had been scrambled by sustained magical overload. "And Elias? Initialize privacy protocols. Full digital blackout for this conversation." "Already implemented, sir," Elias replied with obvious approval. "Though, if I may suggest, the lady's concern appears entirely justified based on your current readings." The observation carried more weight than diplomatic courtesy, reminding me that the Guild's medical monitoring systems had been tracking my increasingly erratic vital signs with growing alarm. The drive to excel, to prove worthy of the trust placed in me by so many people, had led me to override safety protocols and ignore automated health warnings. "Arthur." Elara's voice reached me before she fully entered my office, carrying a mixture of relief and gentle reproach that made my chest tighten with unfamiliar emotion. "The biometric alerts your system sent to Papa's medical staff indicated you've been here for 2 days straight without rest. Is that accurate?" She moved through my office with confident familiarity despite having visited only once before, her violet eyes immediately assessing my condition while a discreet medical scanner in her hand provided real-time data about my physical state. The elegant evening dress she wore suggested she had come directly from some social obligation, yet her primary concern was clearly my welfare rather than the inconvenience of the late hour. "Research requires sustained focus," I replied weakly, attempting to maintain dignity despite being caught in such an obviously compromised state. "Some theoretical breakthroughs can't be achieved through incremental progress or automated analysis." "Arthur," Elara said with the kind of firm gentleness that brooked no argument while consulting the medical readings on her scanner, "you're exhibiting signs of severe neural fatigue and magical system overload. When did you last engage sleep protocols?"
Consuma proper nutrition.
"Allow your biological systems to recover from artificial stimulation." The questions forced me to confront the reality that I couldn't answer any of them with specific timeframes. The past 2 days had blurred together in a haze of theoretical frameworks, data analysis, and obsessive refinement that had consumed my attention so completely that basic human needs had become irrelevant distractions. "The work was important," I said, though even to my own ears the justification sounded hollow. "Integrating your emotional healing research with conventional magical therapy could help thousands of people. The potential applications for treating combat trauma, magical exhaustion, psychological damage from political stress will still be there after you've recovered. Alara interrupted with authority that reminded me she was the daughter of one of the Empire's most powerful nobles. Arthur, you're driving yourself toward a neurological breakdown that will prevent you from helping anyone. She approached my desk where I sat surrounded by holographic displays, research databases, and half-consumed nutrition supplements that my assistant had provided in lieu of actual meals. Her medical scanner was clearly cataloging the extent of my depletion, while her expression grew increasingly concerned as the device provided detailed analysis of my condition. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward my hands with the kind of professional courtesy that healers used when requesting permission to conduct direct examination. I nodded, too exhausted to maintain the pretense that I was functioning normally. Alara's touch was gentle but immediately diagnostic, her healing magic interfacing with the biometric sensors embedded in my skin to assess the damage I had inflicted through sustained neglect of basic biological requirements. "Your neural pathways are showing dangerous levels of artificial stimulation," she said with clinical calm that somehow made her concern more rather than less evident. "Your cardiovascular system is operating on magical enhancement rather than proper rest. Arthur, you're not optimizing your capabilities, you're systematically degrading them." The observation cut through my exhaustion with the force of truth I had been avoiding. My obsessive pursuit of enhanced performance had led me to treat my own biological limitations as obstacles to be overcome rather than parameters to be respected, creating exactly the kind of vulnerability I was supposedly trying to prevent. "I don't know how to stop," I admitted with honesty that surprised us both. "There's always another threat, another crisis, another problem that requires immediate attention. If I'm not strong enough, prepared enough, knowledgeable enough, people get hurt. People die." Alara's expression softened with understanding that went beyond her medical training to touch something deeper about the psychological burden I carried. "Arthur, you can't save everyone by destroying yourself. That's not optimization. That's fear disguised as dedication." The insight hit me like a physical blow because it identified something I had never acknowledged. My relentless pursuit of enhanced capabilities wasn't just about protecting others. It was about the terror of being helpless when people I cared about faced danger. The memory of every failure, every moment when my abilities had proven insufficient, drove me to push beyond reasonable limits in desperate hope of preventing future losses. "The Guild's automated systems can handle routine operations," Alara continued while beginning to weave healing magic that interfaced seamlessly with my body's technological monitoring systems. "Your staff's AI assistants can manage crisis response protocols. Arthur, the organization doesn't need its Grandmaster to be personally overseeing every detail." Her healing magic flowed through my system with warmth that went beyond mere restoration of physical energy. The technique she was using addressed not just magical depletion but the psychological exhaustion that had driven me to such extremes, while my biometric displays showed vital signs returning to healthy parameters for the first time in days. "Better?" Alara asked as the healing magic completed its work, leaving me feeling more genuinely rested than I had in weeks. "Much," I replied, though the restoration of my normal cognitive function made me acutely aware of how compromised my judgment had become. "Alara, thank you. I don't think I realized how badly I needed intervention. Your body's monitoring systems have been sending increasingly urgent warnings," she said with satisfaction that spoke to professional competence rather than personal smugness. "But Arthur, this is a behavioral pattern you need to address rather than just a crisis to recover from. What drives you to override safety protocols this systematically?" The question forced me to examine motivations I had never articulated, even to myself. The weight of responsibility for so many lives, the knowledge that my decisions affected everything from guild members' livelihoods to international political stability, the understanding that inadequacy or failure on my part could cost the people I cared about their safety or their lives. "Fear," I said finally, the admission carrying weight I had never allowed myself to acknowledge. "Terror that I'll be inadequate when it matters most. That someone I care about will suffer because I wasn't smart enough, prepared enough, technologically advanced enough to protect them." Alara's response was to settle into the chair across from my desk with patient attention that suggested she understood the significance of such revelations. The office's privacy screens created a sanctuary where political monitoring and social surveillance couldn't penetrate, allowing for the kind of honest communication that was increasingly rare in our connected world. And you think that exhausting yourself to the point of system failure makes you more capable of protecting people? She asked with gentle persistence that made evasion impossible. It makes me more prepared, I replied, though hearing the logic spoken aloud revealed its fundamental flaws. More knowledgeable about potential solutions, more familiar with technological applications that might prove crucial during emergencies. Arthur, Alara said with quiet wisdom, when you're operating on artificial stimulation rather than proper rest, how reliable is your judgment? How steady are your hands during precise work? How clear is your thinking during actual crises? The questions forced me to confront the reality that my obsessive preparation was actually undermining my effectiveness rather than enhancing it. A guild grandmaster who collapsed from neural overload during an emergency would be useless regardless of his theoretical knowledge or accumulated technological resources. You're right, I admitted with the kind of reluctant recognition that preceded meaningful behavioral change. I've been so focused on becoming capable enough to handle any threat that I've been creating my own critical vulnerabilities. The strongest people I know, Alara said softly, are the ones who understand their limitations and work within them rather than against them. True strength comes from sustainable practices that build capability over time, not from desperate attempts to transcend biological requirements. We sat in comfortable silence for several minutes while I processed both her insights and the profound relief of finally feeling genuinely rested. The research data that had seemed so urgently critical hours earlier now appeared manageable rather than overwhelming, while the theoretical problems that had driven my obsessive focus revealed themselves as complex but solvable challenges rather than existential crises. Alara, I said, studying her face in the soft lighting of my office while privacy screens created gentle luminescence around us. Why did you come here tonight? What made you check on my well-being at such an unusual hour? Her cheeks colored slightly as she considered her response, suggesting that her motivations were more personal than mere charitable concern for an overworked colleague. Papa's medical monitoring systems flagged your biometric anomalies as potentially dangerous. But that wasn't really why I came. What was? I asked, though something in her expression made my heart race with anticipation. Because I realized that your well-being matters to me for reasons that have nothing to do with professional collaboration or political alliance. Alara replied with vulnerability that made my protective instincts flare alongside deeper emotions I was still learning to acknowledge. I care about you, Arthur. Not as the guild grandmaster or as a strategic partner, but as someone whose happiness affects my own peace of mind. The admission created a moment of intimacy that transcended the careful boundaries we had been maintaining throughout our courtship. Looking at this remarkable woman who had traveled across the city in the middle of the night to ensure my welfare, armed with medical technology and genuine concern, I found myself understanding that what was developing between us had moved far beyond strategic calculation into territory that felt both thrilling and terrifying. I care about you too, I replied with honesty that felt both liberating and dangerous. More than I expected to when this started. More than I probably should, given the complexities involved. Should has nothing to do with how we feel, Alara said with quiet wisdom that reminded me why her perspective had become so important to my understanding of the world. The question is what we choose to do with feelings that matter more than convenience or political calculation. Before I could respond, my body's restored energy levels finally encountered the accumulated sleep debt my artificial stimulation had been masking, causing me to sway slightly in my chair. Alara was immediately alert, her medical scanner providing instant assessment of whether further intervention was necessary. You need proper rest, she said with gentle authority. Natural sleep, for at least 8 hours, without any research interfaces or data streams to distract your neural recovery. Will you stay? I asked, the words escaping before I could consider their implications. Not for anything inappropriate, I added quickly, but I find that I rest better knowing you're nearby. Safer, somehow. Alara's smile in response was radiant enough to make the ambient technological displays in my office seem to pulse with increased vibrancy. I'd be honored to stay. Someone should make sure you actually follow medical advice for once. As I finally allowed myself to rest properly for the first time in days, with Alara maintaining peaceful watch while monitoring my recovery through discrete medical systems, I realized that she had accomplished something no amount of training or technological enhancement had achieved. She had made me feel genuinely secure, not because of power or preparation, but because of trust shared between two people who had chosen to care about each other's well-being above their own convenience. The last thought I had before sleep claimed me was that Lady Alara Astoria might be the answer to a question I had never known I was asking. In a world where technology could monitor everything except the human heart, who would care enough to protect the protector? Chapter 769. The Courtship War, 8. The Astoria family's summer estate was renowned throughout the empire for its magnificent gardens and its tradition of hosting intimate gatherings that brought together the most thoughtful members of society for genuine intellectual discourse. As I arrived for what had been billed as an afternoon of philosophical discussion and cultural appreciation, I felt the familiar anticipation that came with knowing these smaller gatherings allowed for more meaningful interaction than the typical crowded social events. Alara had extended personal invitations to a carefully selected group of young nobles and intellectuals, creating an environment that would encourage the kind of substantial conversation that represented the best of imperial cultural life. The guest list was impressively diverse: scholars, artists, political theorists, and social reformers who rarely gathered in the same setting. Arthur, Alara greeted me as I entered the estate's famous library, where the afternoon's discussions would take place. I'm so glad you could attend. I've been looking forward to hearing your thoughts on some of the questions we'll be exploring today. She looked perfectly at ease in the elegant informality of her family's private space, wearing a simple but sophisticated dress that somehow managed to convey both accessibility and refined taste. But it was the genuine excitement in her expression as she welcomed each guest that reminded me why these smaller gatherings brought out the best in her personality. "The honor is mine," I replied, noting how the intimate setting allowed for a different quality of interaction than the public venues where we typically encountered each other. "Your intellectual salons are becoming legendary for bringing together people who might never otherwise have the opportunity to exchange ideas." The afternoon progressed with exactly the kind of sophisticated discussion that made imperial society at its best truly remarkable. Alara had assembled a group of genuine thinkers, creating conversations that moved seamlessly from practical applications of magical theory to complex philosophical questions about justice, governance, and social responsibility. What impressed me most was watching Alara moderate these discussions with the kind of skillful grace that encouraged everyone to contribute their best thinking. She had a remarkable talent for identifying the underlying connections between different perspectives and helping participants find common ground even when they started from apparently opposing positions. The question of preventive intervention versus reactive response seems to apply across multiple domains, she observed during a particularly intense discussion about social policy. Whether we're talking about healing, education, or conflict resolution, the principles remain remarkably consistent. "Indeed," replied one of the visiting scholars, "though the challenge is always determining when intervention is helpful versus when it becomes interference with natural processes of growth and development." I found myself genuinely engaged with these conversations in ways that went beyond strategic necessity. The quality of thinking on display was exceptional, and Alara's ability to facilitate meaningful dialogue between very different personalities was genuinely impressive. But as the afternoon progressed, I found myself paying increasing attention to the dynamics between Alara and her other suitors. Prince Valerian had positioned himself prominently in the discussions, using his royal education and natural charisma to command attention during many of the conversations. Jack participated with his usual intellectual sophistication, though I continued to recognize his contributions as calculated performance rather than genuine engagement. What troubled me was watching how both men interacted with Alara when they thought others weren't paying close attention. Valerian's charm carried an increasingly possessive edge, as if he was becoming irritated by the need to compete for attention in what he clearly felt should be a more controlled environment. Jack's behavior was subtler but equally concerning, as he seemed to be studying Alara's responses to various topics with the kind of analytical intensity that suggested he was gathering intelligence rather than simply enjoying conversation. "Lady Alara," Valerian said during a brief pause in the broader discussion, "might I have a word with you privately? There are some matters related to upcoming family events that we should discuss." The request was phrased politely enough, but something in his tone made my protective instincts immediately alert. The way he was looking at Alara carried an edge of frustration that suggested this wouldn't be the kind of gentle conversation appropriate for such a refined gathering. "Of course, Your Highness," Alara replied with the kind of gracious compliance that had been trained into her since childhood, though I caught a flicker of something that might have been reluctance in her expression. As they moved toward a more secluded section of the library, I found myself torn between respecting Alara's autonomy and my growing concern about Valerian's increasingly possessive behavior. The prince's public charm was impressive, but I had seen enough glimpses of his true nature to know that private conversations with him might not be as pleasant as their public interactions suggested. "Concerning development," Jack observed quietly, positioning himself where he could observe their private conversation without appearing to eavesdrop. His attention was focused entirely on Alara rather than on whatever Valerian might be saying, which struck me as oddly intense for someone supposedly just interested in causing problems for my plans. Within minutes, it became clear that the private conversation was not proceeding smoothly. Valerian's voice, though kept low enough to avoid disturbing the other guests, carried an edge of frustration that was becoming increasingly obvious. Alara's responses were more subdued, her body language suggesting growing discomfort with whatever direction their discussion was taking. Then I saw Valerian's hand move to Alara's arm with a grip that looked far too firm for polite conversation, and her expression shifted to something approaching genuine fear. "Lady Alara," I said clearly, crossing the library with purposeful strides that drew the attention of everyone present. "Didn't you want to show me your family's collection of historical healing texts? I believe you mentioned some rare manuscripts that might be relevant to our earlier discussion about preventive intervention strategies." The interruption was obvious and deliberate, a direct challenge to Valerian's attempt at private intimidation. Every guest in the library understood exactly what had just happened. The guild grandmaster had publicly intervened to extract Lady Alara from whatever the prince had been doing to cause her obvious distress. Valerian's reaction was immediate and telling. His charming mask slipped completely for a moment, revealing a flash of genuine fury before he managed to reassert his composure. But the damage was done. Everyone had seen the prince's true face, if only briefly. "Grandmaster Nightingale," Valerian said with forced politeness that barely concealed his rage, "how thoughtful of you to take such an active interest in Lady Alara's scholarly pursuits. I find intellectual curiosity should always be encouraged and protected." I replied evenly, positioning myself between Valerian and Alara in a way that made my protective intent unmistakable, especially when it involves such innovative thinking about important social issues. The tension in the library was now palpable, with every guest recognizing that they were witnessing a direct confrontation between two of the Empire's most powerful young men. Jack watched the entire exchange with obvious fascination, though his attention remained focused primarily on Alara's reaction rather than the broader political implications. "Perhaps," Alara said with the kind of diplomatic grace that had made her famous throughout the Empire, "we should return to our group discussion. I believe Professor Meridian had some interesting points about educational reform that deserve further exploration." The suggestion was clearly intended to defuse the situation before it escalated into something that could create lasting political complications. But as we rejoined the broader group, I noticed how Alara positioned herself closer to me than to Valerian, and how her relief at being extracted from their private conversation was obvious to anyone paying attention. The remainder of the afternoon proceeded with forced normalcy, but the dynamics had shifted fundamentally. Valerian's charm carried a harder edge, as if he was struggling to maintain his public persona while dealing with the humiliation of being publicly challenged in front of the Empire's intellectual elite. Jack continued his usual pattern of sophisticated conversation, though he seemed increasingly focused on the changed dynamics between all the major players. Most importantly, watching Alara navigate the rest of the gathering with obvious strain despite her gracious hosting made me realize something that changed everything about my approach to this mission. As the gathering concluded and guests began to depart, I found myself looking at Alara with new understanding. She had spent the entire afternoon facilitating brilliant discussions while managing the stress of unwanted attention from Valerian and subtle manipulation from Jack, all while maintaining the kind of gracious hospitality that made everyone feel valued and heard. This remarkable woman was being systematically manipulated by forces she didn't understand, kept ignorant of dangers that threatened not just her happiness but her very life. She deserved better than being treated as a political asset by everyone around her, including me. The realization hit me with sudden clarity. Alara Astoria deserved to know the truth about what was really happening in her life. The woman who had spent the afternoon facilitating discussions about preventive intervention and addressing root causes deserved to understand the true source of the dangers surrounding her. She deserved the opportunity to make informed decisions about her own life rather than being maneuvered by people who saw her as a means to their own ends. As I prepared to request a private audience with her, I felt the weight of decision settling on my shoulders. Everything I had worked for could be at risk, but keeping her ignorant while everyone around her played games with her life had become morally unacceptable. The time had come to tell Alara the complete truth. Chapter 770, Alara's Heart. When Arthur requested a private meeting with me, using the kind of formal language that suggested serious matters rather than casual conversation, I found myself both curious and slightly apprehensive. Our interactions had always been pleasant and intellectually stimulating, but there was something in his expression during the request that hinted at depths I hadn't previously glimpsed. The Astoria Estate's private study was one of my favorite rooms, filled with books, comfortable seating, and the kind of peaceful atmosphere that encouraged honest conversation. As I waited for Arthur's arrival, I found myself wondering what could be so important that it required such formal privacy. Perhaps he wanted to discuss collaboration on some of the social reform ideas we had explored during our various conversations. "Lady Alara," Arthur said as he entered the study, his expression carrying an unusual combination of determination and what might have been concern. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. What I need to discuss with you is complex, and I hope you'll bear with me as I explain." "Of course," I replied, gesturing for him to take a seat across from me. I'm always interested in complex discussions, particularly when they involve someone whose perspectives I've come to value so highly. Arthur settled into his chair with obvious tension, as if he was preparing to undertake something difficult but necessary. "Alara, before I begin, I need you to promise me that you'll listen to everything I have to say before making any judgments. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but I assure you that every word is true." The seriousness in his voice made something flutter nervously in my chest. Arthur had always been straightforward in our conversations, never given to dramatic exaggeration or mysterious pronouncements. If he was asking for such a promise, whatever he intended to share must be genuinely extraordinary. "I promise," I said simply, meaning it completely. "What I'm about to show you," Arthur continued, "is something that very few people in the world know exists. It's the source of knowledge that most would consider impossible for any human to possess." He closed his eyes for a moment, and then something remarkable happened. The air beside him began to shimmer with a soft, golden light, and slowly, a small figure materialized. A creature that took my breath away with its ethereal beauty. She appeared to be a child, but there was something ageless in her amethyst eyes that spoke of wisdom accumulated over centuries or perhaps millennia. Her hair sparkled with contained starlight, and there was an aura of power around her that made my magical senses resonate with recognition and awe. "Alara," Arthur said quietly, "I'd like you to meet Luna. She's a Chelan, the one who bonded with Emperor Julius Slatemark 1,000 years ago." My academic knowledge immediately provided context that made my eyes widen with shock. Chelans were legendary beings, creatures of such power and wisdom that they were considered myths by most scholars. Especially Luna, the one bonded with founder Emperor Julius Slatemark. "Hello, Alara," Luna said, her voice carrying the musical quality that all the ancient texts attributed to Chelan speech. "Arthur has told me much about you. Your wisdom and compassion are exactly what he described." I found myself staring in fascination, my mind racing through the implications of what I was seeing. If this was truly a Chelan, and every instinct I possessed confirmed that it was, then Arthur's access to impossible knowledge suddenly made sense. "Chelans," I said slowly, working through my understanding, "are said to possess the ability to perceive the flow of fate across time. They can see possible futures and understand the consequences of present actions. Very good, Luna replied with obvious approval. Arthur leaned forward, his expression serious. Alara, what I'm about to tell you comes from Luna's ability to perceive potential futures. She's shown me what will happen if current events are allowed to proceed without intervention. What kind of intervention? I asked, though something in his tone made me suspect I wouldn't like the answer. The potential engagement between you and Prince Valerian, Arthur said directly, will lead to tragedy if it's allowed to proceed. Not just personal tragedy, but civil war that could destroy the empire. The words hit me like a physical blow. I had known that my potential marriage to Valerian carried political implications, but the idea that it could lead to war seemed impossible to comprehend. I don't understand, I said weakly. How could a marriage lead to civil war? Arthur's expression grew grim. Because Prince Valerian's true nature is very different from his public persona. In private, he's psychologically abusive, controlling, and eventually violent. Over time, that abuse would break your spirit completely. You would take your own life to escape what your existence had become. The casual way he delivered such a horrific prediction made me feel dizzy with shock. The idea that anyone could predict my suicide as if it was an inevitable fact was both terrifying and deeply disturbing. That's impossible, I whispered, though even as I spoke, I wasn't sure. Your father would be devastated by your death, Arthur continued relentlessly. He would investigate and discover evidence of Valerian's abuse. The confrontation between Archduke Leopold and the imperial family would fracture the empire's unity, creating the conditions for civil war at exactly the moment when external threats require absolute solidarity. Luna's voice added weight to Arthur's words. The patterns are clear to those who can perceive them. Without intervention, the timeline leads to destruction for many, many people. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process information that challenged everything I thought I understood about my life and future. The idea that my personal choices could have such far-reaching consequences was overwhelming, but the presence of Luna made it impossible to dismiss as fantasy or exaggeration. What kind of intervention? I asked finally, though I suspected I already knew. I'm proposing that you agree to an engagement with me instead, Arthur said simply. Not because I'm trying to manipulate you for personal gain, but because it's the most effective way to prevent the tragic timeline from unfolding. The proposal was so straightforward that it took me a moment to fully comprehend what he was suggesting. You want me to agree to marry you to prevent a civil war? I want you to agree to an engagement that would protect you from Valerian's abuse, while also protecting the empire from the consequences of that abuse, Arthur corrected gently. What our relationship becomes beyond that strategic necessity is something we can determine together, without pressure or predetermined expectations. I found myself studying his face, looking for any hint of deception or manipulation. But all I could see was genuine concern and what appeared to be complete honesty about his motivations. Arthur, I said carefully, you mentioned your unique romantic situation. 5 girlfriends who all know about each other and somehow manage to maintain harmonious relationships. Are you saying they would be comfortable with adding me to that arrangement? I've discussed this situation with all of them, Arthur replied. They understand the stakes involved, and they support the intervention completely. Not because they want to share me with another woman, but because they recognize that preventing civil war is more important than personal convenience. The idea that 5 remarkable women had discussed my potential inclusion in their unconventional arrangement and agreed to support it was both touching and slightly overwhelming. It suggested a level of sophistication and selflessness that challenged many of my assumptions about human nature. They must be extraordinary people, I said softly. They are, Arthur agreed with obvious affection. And I believe they would come to value you for the same reasons I do. Your intelligence, your compassion, and your potential to make the world better. I sat quietly for several minutes, trying to process everything I had learned. The revelation about Luna's nature, the predictions about my potential future with Valerian, and Arthur's proposal all swirled together in my mind as I struggled to understand what choice I was really being offered. Arthur, I said finally, if I agree to this engagement, what would you expect from me? What would our relationship actually involve? Honesty, Arthur replied without hesitation. Mutual respect. The freedom to develop whatever feelings might emerge naturally, without pressure or artificial expectations. And most importantly, the knowledge that you're safe from harm and free to pursue your own goals and interests. The simplicity and sincerity of his answer made something warm unfurl in my chest. This wasn't a man trying to acquire a political asset or claim a romantic prize. This was someone offering to protect me while expecting nothing in return except the opportunity to prevent a tragedy. And if I choose not to agree? I asked, needing to understand all my options. Then I'll respect your decision completely, Arthur said with conviction that I believed absolutely. But I'll also continue trying to find other ways to prevent the tragic timeline, because the consequences are too severe to ignore. Looking at this remarkable man who had revealed impossible truths to protect me from dangers I hadn't even known existed, I found myself making a decision that felt both terrifying and strangely right. I agree, I said quietly. Not just because I want to prevent civil war, though that's certainly important, but because you've treated me with more honesty and respect than anyone else in my life. If you're willing to protect me while asking for nothing in return, then yes, I'll accept your proposal. The relief in Arthur's expression was immediate and genuine, making me realize how much he had been hoping for this outcome. Thank you, Alara. I promise you won't regret this decision. As Luna smiled at both of us with obvious approval, I felt the strange combination of fear and anticipation that came with stepping into an unknown future. Whatever complications lay ahead, at least I would be facing them with someone who valued my safety and happiness above his own convenience. For the first time in months, I felt genuinely hopeful about what my life might become. Chapter 771. 6 Engagements. 1. The sacred grove of the Windward family was one of the most beautiful and restricted locations in the entire northern continent. A place where ancient magic had preserved the natural wonder of the aurora borealis in permanent, ethereal display above a pristine winter landscape that seemed untouched by time itself. Getting access to this hallowed ground had required calling in a significant favor with Lucifer, but seeing Rachel's expression as we walked through the snow-covered path toward the grove's heart made every moment of diplomatic negotiation worthwhile. Arthur? Rachel breathed, her deep blue eyes wide with wonder as she took in the dancing lights overhead. This is absolutely magical. I've heard about this place since childhood, but I never dreamed I would actually see it. The aurora cast shifting patterns of green, blue, and silver across the snow-covered clearing, creating an atmosphere that seemed designed by nature itself for momentous occasions. Huge trees formed a natural cathedral around us, their snow-laden branches reaching toward the celestial display like arms raised in eternal celebration. I wanted to share something special with you, I replied, watching how the ethereal light played across her golden hair and made her eyes sparkle with reflected starlight. Somewhere that could match the beauty and grace you bring to everything in my life. Rachel's cheeks flushed with the kind of deep pleasure that always made my heart race when I managed to surprise her with genuine romantic gestures. Despite all the time we had spent together, despite the depth of our relationship, she still reacted to expressions of affection with the enthusiasm of someone discovering love for the first time. We walked deeper into the grove, following a path that wound between crystal formations that had been shaped by centuries of magical influence. The aurora overhead seemed to respond to our presence, the lights growing more vivid and dancing in patterns that created an ever-changing tapestry of celestial beauty. How did you manage to arrange this? Rachel asked, turning to face me with obvious curiosity. The Windward family guards access to this place more carefully than their royal treasury. I may have mentioned to Lucifer that I needed somewhere appropriately magnificent for a very important conversation with a very important person, I replied with carefully controlled casualness. He seemed to understand the significance. The truth was that convincing Lucifer to grant access had required explaining the general nature of my intentions without revealing the specific details. But the Northern Prince had proven remarkably accommodating once he understood that this was about proposing to someone I genuinely cared about rather than simply showing off for political advantage. A very important conversation? Rachel repeated, her voice carrying a note of breathless anticipation that suggested she was beginning to suspect this evening might involve more than a romantic date. We reached the center of the grove, where a natural clearing provided an unobstructed view of the aurora display overhead. The ancient magic that preserved this place had created a pocket of perfect climate, warm enough to be comfortable despite the northern winter, while maintaining the pristine beauty of the snow-covered landscape. "Rachel," I said, turning to face her fully as the dancing lights overhead seemed to intensify in response to the moment's significance. "Over the past few years, you've become far more than I ever expected when we first met." Her breath caught as she recognized the seriousness in my tone, her deep blue eyes reflecting both the aurora's glow and something that looked remarkably like hope mixed with almost desperate longing. "You've shown me what it means to truly care about other people's welfare," I continued, taking her hands in mine and feeling how they trembled slightly with emotion. "Your dedication to healing, to helping those who can't help themselves, to making the world better through compassion and skill. It's inspired me to become a better person." "Arthur," Rachel whispered, her voice carrying the kind of raw emotion that she rarely allowed herself to express so openly. "You've stood by me through every challenge, supported every decision, trusted me even when my choices seemed impossible to understand," I said, studying her face and seeing the tears beginning to gather in her eyes. "You've been my partner, my confidant, and my closest friend." I released her hands and reached into my coat pocket, withdrawing the ring case that had been crafted by the finest artisans in the empire according to specifications I had spent weeks perfecting. The case itself was made from rare northern crystal that seemed to capture and hold aurora light within its crystalline structure. "Rachel Creighton," I said, dropping to one knee on the snow-covered ground as the aurora overhead burst into the most magnificent display I had ever witnessed. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The case opened to reveal a ring that represented months of careful design and magical craftsmanship. The band was forged from pure etherite that had been infused with northern magical traditions, creating a foundation that would enhance Rachel's natural healing abilities while providing protection against harmful magical influences. Set into the band were 3 perfectly matched northern sapphires, each one cut to reflect the deep blue of her eyes and arranged in a pattern that symbolized the eternal cycle of healing, growth, and renewal. But it was the magical properties embedded within the etherite that made this ring truly special. The ancient enchantments woven into its structure would allow Rachel to channel her healing magic with unprecedented precision and power, while also creating a bond between us that would allow me to sense if she was ever in danger or distress. Rachel's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Her hands flew to cover her mouth as tears began streaming down her cheeks, her entire body trembling with emotion that seemed too intense to contain. "Yes," she breathed, the word barely audible through her tears. "Yes, yes, of course yes." I slipped the ring onto her finger, watching as the etherite immediately began to resonate with her natural magical energy, creating a soft glow that seemed to pulse in harmony with her heartbeat. The sapphires caught the aurora light and reflected it back in patterns that made her hand appear to be holding captured starlight. "Arthur," Rachel said, her voice breaking with the intensity of her emotions. "I've dreamed of this moment for so long, but I never dared hope it would actually happen. I love you so much it sometimes frightens me with how completely you've become part of who I am." She threw her arms around me with such enthusiasm that we both nearly lost our balance, her lips finding mine in a kiss that carried years of accumulated affection and longing. The aurora overhead seemed to explode in response to our emotions, painting the entire grove in shifting patterns of celestial light that made the moment feel like something from a fairy tale. "I love you too," I murmured against her lips, meaning every word with a depth that still sometimes surprised me. "More than I ever thought possible. You've changed my life in ways I'm still discovering. I was so afraid you might never propose," Rachel confessed as we held each other in the center of the magical grove, the aurora continuing its ethereal dance overhead. "I knew you cared about me, but with everything else in your life, all your responsibilities and other relationships, I worried that marriage might be too much to hope for." The vulnerability in her admission made my chest tighten with protective tenderness. Rachel's devotion to me had always been absolute and unwavering, but I was beginning to understand how much uncertainty she had been carrying about the security of our future together. "Rachel," I said firmly, cupping her face in my hands so she had to meet my eyes. "You never have to doubt your place in my life again. This ring represents a promise that you'll always be one of the most important people in my world, regardless of what complications or challenges we might face. I know there will be adjustments," she said with the kind of practical wisdom that balanced her emotional intensity. "Sharing you with 5 other remarkable women won't always be easy. But Arthur, I'd rather have part of your heart than all of anyone else's. You're worth any compromise." The absolute conviction in her voice reminded me why I had fallen for her in the first place. Rachel's capacity for love was both generous and fierce, encompassing not just her feelings for me but genuine care for the other women in my life who she recognized as deserving of happiness. "The others are going to be so excited," she continued with obvious joy, her tears now mixed with laughter. "We've all been hoping this day would come, but none of us wanted to pressure you about timing." As we stood together in the sacred grove, surrounded by the eternal beauty of the northern aurora, I felt the profound satisfaction that came from making someone I genuinely cared about happier than I had ever seen her. Rachel's joy was infectious and absolute, transforming an already magical evening into something that would remain perfect in my memory for the rest of my life. The first proposal was complete, and it had exceeded even my highest expectations for how meaningful this moment could be. Chapter 772. 6 Engagements. 2. 3 days had passed since my proposal to Rachel in the Windward Sacred Grove, and I continued to be impressed by her discretion in keeping our engagement private. Despite her overwhelming joy, which I caught glimpses of whenever she thought no one was looking, she had maintained perfect secrecy about the ring now hidden beneath her formal gloves and the promise that had transformed her entire outlook on our future together. "She hasn't told anyone," I mused to myself as I made final preparations for this evening's proposal to Cecilia. "Not even a hint to the other girls," despite how excited she must be to share the news. Rachel's ability to maintain such discipline while practically glowing with happiness demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that made her such an effective saintess. She understood instinctively that each proposal needed to feel special and individual, rather than being overshadowed by knowledge of previous engagements. Her gift of preserving the surprise factor for the others was yet another reason why I had fallen for her so completely. But tonight belonged to Cecilia, and the setting I had chosen reflected both her royal status and the unique nature of our relationship. The Imperial Palace's highest balcony was normally restricted to the Emperor and his immediate family, but my position as Guild Grandmaster had made it possible to arrange private access for what I had described to Emperor Quinn as a matter of significant political and personal importance. The location offered an unobstructed view of the entire Slatemark Empire spread out below, with the capital city's lights beginning to twinkle as sunset approached. "Arthur," Cecilia's voice came from behind me as she arrived at the appointed time. "This is quite the dramatic setting you've chosen for our evening together. Should I be expecting something particularly momentous?" I turned to see her silhouetted against the palace's elegant architecture, wearing a sophisticated dress in deep crimson that complemented her blonde hair and made her eyes appear to glow like rubies in the fading sunlight. She moved with the natural grace that had been trained into her since childhood, but there was something in her expression that suggested she had suspicions about this evening's true purpose. "You could say that," I replied with carefully controlled casualness, gesturing toward the breathtaking vista spread below us. "I wanted to share this view with you because it represents something important about our relationship." Cecilia stepped closer to the balcony's edge, her crimson eyes surveying the empire with obvious appreciation for both its beauty and its significance. "The view from the top," she observed with characteristic insight. "Very symbolic, Arthur. Are you making some kind of point about power and perspective?" "Among other things," I confirmed, moving to stand beside her as the sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed designed to complement her appearance. "Cecilia, when I look at this empire, I see not just what it is now, but what it could become. And increasingly, I find it impossible to imagine that future without you as part of it." Her breath caught slightly at the seriousness in my tone, though she maintained the composed exterior that characterized her public persona. Arthur, what exactly are you saying? I'm saying that over the past few years, you've shown me what true partnership looks like, I replied, studying her profile as she gazed out over her future domain. Not just in our personal relationship, but in how we approach the challenges facing the empire. Your political instincts, your magical abilities, your understanding of what leadership actually requires, they complement my own strengths in ways that could reshape this entire continent. Cecilia turned to face me fully, her crimson eyes reflecting the sunset's glow as she recognized the direction this conversation was taking. You're talking about more than just romance, aren't you? I'm talking about building something together that neither of us could achieve alone, I confirmed, reaching into my coat to withdraw the ring case that had been crafted specifically for this moment. A partnership that combines political power with genuine affection, strategic alliance with personal devotion. The case was made from imperial crimson crystal that had been enchanted to capture and hold flame within its crystalline structure, creating an effect that made it appear to burn with internal fire. As I opened it to reveal the ring inside, the sunset light seemed to ignite the entire contents in brilliant display. Cecilia Slatemark, I said, dropping to one knee on the balcony as the empire spread out below us like a map of our potential future. Would you do me the honor of becoming not just my wife, but my partner in reshaping this world? The ring was a masterpiece of magical craftsmanship that had required the finest artisans in the empire working with materials that cost more than most nobles' annual income. The band was forged from pure etherite that had been infused with imperial flame magic, creating a foundation that would amplify Cecilia's natural magical authority while providing protection against any attempts to undermine her political power. Set into the band was a single, perfect crimson gem that seemed to contain actual fire within its crystalline structure. The stone had been cut in a pattern that would focus and enhance her emerging archwitch abilities, while also creating a visual representation of the imperial crown she would one day wear. But it was the magical properties embedded within the etherite that made this ring truly worthy of a future empress. The enchantments woven into its structure would allow Cecilia to channel her political and magical authority with unprecedented effectiveness, while also creating a bond between us that would enable perfect coordination during any crisis that might threaten the empire. Cecilia's reaction was immediate but characteristically controlled. Her crimson eyes widened as she took in the ring's magnificence, and I saw her quick mind immediately grasping both its symbolic significance and its practical implications. Arthur, she breathed, her usual composure finally cracking to reveal the genuine emotion beneath. It's absolutely perfect. How did you know exactly what I would want? Because I've been paying attention to who you really are, I replied, slipping the ring onto her finger and watching as the etherite immediately began to resonate with her natural magical energy. Not just the crown princess everyone sees in public, but the woman who dreams of building an empire worthy of its people's trust and devotion. The ring settled onto her finger as if it had been made specifically for her, which, of course, it had. The crimson gem caught the sunset light and reflected it back in patterns that made her hand appear to be wreathed in controlled flame, while the etherite band pulsed with magical energy that seemed to enhance her natural aura of authority. Yes, Cecilia said clearly, her voice carrying the kind of decisive certainty that characterized all her most important decisions. Yes, Arthur, absolutely yes. I've been hoping for this moment longer than you probably realize. She pulled me to my feet and kissed me with the kind of passionate intensity that she rarely allowed herself to display, her usual political control giving way to genuine emotional expression. The sunset continued to paint the sky in brilliant colors around us, creating a backdrop that seemed designed for exactly this kind of momentous occasion. I love you, she murmured against my lips. But more than that, I respect you. I admire your vision for what we could accomplish together. This isn't just about marriage. It's about partnership in the truest sense. Exactly, I agreed, holding her close as the lights of the capital city began to twinkle below us like earthbound stars. Together, we can build something that will benefit not just ourselves, but everyone who depends on the empire for stability and prosperity. The others don't know yet, do they? Cecilia asked with characteristic perceptiveness, noting the careful timing of this proposal. You're doing this individually, so each of us gets our own special moment. Rachel has been remarkably discreet, I confirmed with obvious admiration for both women. She understands that each relationship deserves its own recognition. Smart woman, Cecilia replied with genuine respect, though I imagine she's practically vibrating with excitement about finally getting engaged to you. As we stood together on the imperial balcony, looking out over the empire that would one day be partially hers to govern, I felt the profound satisfaction that came from building something meaningful with someone who truly understood the scope of what we were attempting to achieve. When this becomes public, Cecilia said thoughtfully, it's going to change everything about how people perceive both of us politically. Are you ready for that level of scrutiny? I asked, wanting to ensure she understood the full implications. Arthur? Cecilia replied with a smile that combined affection with steel-hard determination. I've been preparing for this my entire life. The only difference now is that I won't be facing the challenges alone. The second proposal was complete, and it had established exactly the kind of partnership that could reshape the political landscape of the entire continent. Chapter 773. 6 Engagements. 3. The hidden mountain lake on the eastern continent was one of Serafina's new most closely guarded secrets. A pristine body of water fed by glacial streams that maintained a temperature cold enough to make most people's teeth chatter just from looking at it. When she had mentioned during one of our conversations that she sometimes traveled here to swim alone when she needed to clear her mind, I had filed that information away as potentially useful for understanding her unique personality. Now, standing beside the crystalline lake as dawn broke over the surrounding peaks, I was beginning to understand why she found this place so appealing. You're certain you want to do this? Serafina asked, studying my expression with those ice-blue eyes that seemed to see straight through any pretense or uncertainty. The water temperature is not what most people would consider pleasant. She stood at the lake's edge wearing a simple but elegant bikini that somehow managed to be both practical and aesthetically pleasing, her silver hair catching the early morning light in ways that made it appear almost luminescent. Despite the cold air, she seemed completely comfortable, as if the mountain's chill was exactly what she needed to feel truly alive. I've been looking forward to this, I replied honestly, noting how the anticipation in her expression was carefully controlled but unmistakably genuine. Besides, I trust your judgment about what constitutes an enjoyable experience. Serafina's rare smile, genuine rather than merely polite, made the prospect of freezing water seem entirely worthwhile. In that case, try to keep up. Without further ceremony, she dove into the lake with the kind of fluid grace that characterized all her movements, disappearing beneath the surface with barely a splash. I followed immediately, and the shock of the glacial water hitting my body was like being struck by controlled lightning. But as the initial shock faded, I began to understand what drew Serafina to this experience. The cold was invigorating rather than merely uncomfortable, sharpening every sense and creating a kind of crystalline clarity of thought that was impossible to achieve under normal circumstances. Swimming in water this cold required complete focus and present-moment awareness that left no room for distraction or unnecessary thinking. Better than expected? Serafina asked as we surfaced together near the lake's center, her ice-blue eyes bright with the kind of quiet satisfaction that indicated she was genuinely enjoying sharing this experience with me. Much better, I confirmed, noting how the cold water seemed to enhance rather than diminish her natural beauty. I can see why you find this restorative. It's like meditation through controlled challenge. Exactly, she replied with obvious pleasure at my understanding. Most people assume I swim in cold water because I enjoy suffering, but it's actually about achieving clarity. The cold eliminates everything except what's truly important. We swam together for nearly an hour, sometimes racing across the lake's width, sometimes simply floating and enjoying the pristine mountain scenery that surrounded us. What struck me most was how this environment brought out a different side of Serafina's personality, still controlled and precise, but with an underlying joy that she rarely allowed herself to display in more formal settings. You're different here, I observed as we made our way back toward the shore, both of us invigorated rather than exhausted by the challenging swim. Different how? Serafina asked, though something in her tone suggested she knew exactly what I meant. More, Yourself, I suppose, I replied, choosing my words carefully, less concerned with maintaining the perfect composure that everyone expects from you. We reached the shallows and stood together in the chest-deep water, the morning sun creating patterns of light and shadow that made the entire lake seem to sparkle with contained magic. Serafina's expression grew thoughtful as she considered my observation. This place represents freedom from expectations, she said finally. Here, I don't have to be the perfect Eastern princess or the flawless swordswoman or the diplomatic representative of my continent. I can just be me. The vulnerability in her admission made something warm unfurl in my chest, despite the frigid water surrounding us. Serafina's Kaderi nature meant that moments of genuine emotional openness were rare and precious, to be treasured rather than taken for granted. Serafina, I said, moving closer to her in the shallow water. You should know that I've always preferred the real you to any of the masks you feel obligated to wear for other people. Her ice-blue eyes widened slightly at the directness of my statement, though she maintained the controlled composure that characterized even her most emotional moments. Arthur, you've shown me what it means to find strength through discipline, I continued, studying her face as the morning light played across her features. Your dedication to excellence, your unwavering principles, your ability to remain centered even in the midst of chaos, they've made me a better person. I reached into the waterproof pouch I had secured to my swimming outfit, withdrawing the ring case that had been specially designed to withstand even glacial water temperatures. The case itself was carved from Eastern ice crystal that would never melt, creating a container worthy of what it held. You've been my anchor, I said, opening the case to reveal the ring inside as we stood together in the pristine mountain lake. The one person I can always count on to provide honest counsel and unwavering support, regardless of how complicated situations become. The ring was a masterpiece of Eastern craftsmanship that had required months of collaboration with the finest artisans in the mountain kingdoms. The band was forged from pure etherite that had been carved to resemble crystalline ice, creating a foundation that would enhance Serafina's natural sword techniques while providing protection against any magic that might attempt to compromise her legendary composure. Embedded within the ice crystal design were delicate plum blossom engravings that seemed to bloom across the ring's surface, each one carved with such precision that they appeared to move in the shifting light. The blossoms were inlaid with silver that matched her hair perfectly, creating a visual representation of the Eastern spring that she had once described as her favorite season. But it was the magical properties woven into the etherite that made this ring truly special for someone of Serafina's abilities. The enchantments would allow her to channel her sword techniques with unprecedented precision and power, while also creating a bond between us that would enable perfect coordination during combat situations. Serafina Zenith, I said, holding the ring case above the water as the dawn light made the ice crystal appear to glow with internal fire. Would you honor me by becoming my wife? Her reaction was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew how to read her expressions. Her ice-blue eyes grew wider as she took in the ring's beauty, and I saw her quick mind immediately grasping both its symbolic significance and its practical applications for her martial arts. Arthur, she breathed, her usual controlled tone carrying an undertone of genuine amazement. It's perfect. How did you know to incorporate the plum blossoms? Because you mentioned once that they represent resilience and hope, I replied, slipping the ring onto her finger and watching as the etherite immediately began to resonate with her natural magical energy. Qualities that you embody more completely than anyone I've ever known. The ring settled onto her finger as if it had been waiting for her specifically, the ice crystal design seeming to pulse with cold fire that matched the mountain lake around us. The plum blossom engravings caught the morning light and reflected it back in patterns that made her hand appear to be wreathed in crystalline beauty. For a moment, Serafina simply stared at the ring, her expression cycling through emotions too complex for most people to follow. Then she looked up at me with ice-blue eyes that held more warmth than I had ever seen from her. Yes, she said simply, the single word carrying absolute conviction despite her typical economy of expression. Of course, yes. She moved closer to me in the shallow water, her hands finding my face as she kissed me with the kind of controlled passion that characterized everything she did. The kiss was perfect, neither too restrained nor too overwhelming, but exactly right for this moment and this place that meant so much to her. "I love you," she said quietly against my lips, the admission all the more powerful for how rarely she expressed such sentiments directly. "I have for longer than you probably realize, but I wasn't certain you saw me as more than a reliable ally." "Serafina?" I replied with conviction that made her eyes brighten. "You've never been just an ally to me. You've been the person who keeps me grounded when everything else threatens to spiral out of control." As we stood together in the glacial lake, surrounded by the pristine beauty of the eastern mountains, I felt the profound satisfaction that came from sharing a perfect moment with someone who had chosen to reveal her true self rather than hiding behind protective composure. "The others don't know yet?" she asked with characteristic perceptiveness, noting the careful timing and privacy of this proposal. "Rachel and Cecilia have been remarkably discreet about their own engagements," I confirmed. "Everyone deserves their own special moment." "Wise," Serafina replied with obvious approval. "Though I suspect the remaining 3 will be growing curious about all these private dates you've been arranging." "Halfway done," Luna's voice repeated in my mind with obvious amusement. "Though I have to admit, proposing in glacial water while maintaining romantic atmosphere shows impressive dedication to personalization." The 3rd proposal was complete, and it had deepened my relationship with someone whose strength and loyalty made her irreplaceable in both my personal life and my broader strategic plans. Chapter 774. 6 Engagements. 4. The Ashbluff family's private necromantic gardens were legendary throughout the Western continent, a collection of rare and dangerous magical plants that had been cultivated over centuries to create one of the most impressive displays of controlled death magic in the known world. Getting access to this restricted sanctuary had required calling in a significant favor with Jean Ashbluff, but watching Rose's expression as we walked through the garden's shadowed pathways made it more than worth it. "Arthur?" Rose breathed, her brown eyes wide with genuine awe as she took in the spectacular array of necromantic flora surrounding us. "This is absolutely incredible. I've read about some of these specimens in theoretical texts, but I never imagined I would see them growing in their natural magical environment." The garden was unlike anything most people could imagine. Plants that thrived on deep dark rather than sunlight, flowers that bloomed with ethereal beauty while radiating controlled danger, and trees whose leaves whispered with the voices of ancient spirits. The Ashbluff family had spent generations learning to cultivate these specimens safely, creating a space that was both breathtakingly beautiful and subtly menacing. "I thought you might appreciate seeing how the Western continent approaches necromantic cultivation," I replied, watching how she moved through the garden with the confident stride of someone completely comfortable around magical plants that would terrify most visitors. Jean mentioned that their techniques differ significantly from the Springshaper methods. Rose paused beside a particularly impressive specimen, a flowering vine whose blooms seemed to absorb light rather than reflecting it, creating patches of absolute darkness that somehow enhanced rather than diminished the garden's otherworldly beauty. "The integration is remarkable," she observed with obvious professional admiration. "Springshaper gardens focus on individual plant excellence, but this creates an entire ecosystem where each species supports and enhances the others. The magical synergy must be extraordinary." Her auburn hair caught the filtered light that managed to penetrate the garden's carefully controlled shadows, while her brown eyes reflected the kind of intellectual excitement that always made my heart race. Rose approached necromantic magic with the same combination of business acumen and genuine passion that characterized everything she did, treating even the most dangerous specimens as fascinating puzzles to be understood and appreciated. "Look at this arrangement," she continued, gesturing toward a section where multiple varieties of death-touched plants had been arranged in patterns that created visible flows of necromantic energy. "They're using the root systems to create a natural magical amplification network. The efficiency must be incredible compared to traditional individual cultivation." We walked deeper into the garden, following pathways lined with plants that seemed to respond to our presence with subtle shifts in their magical emanations. Rose moved with the kind of confident familiarity that came from a lifetime of working with necromantic flora, completely unintimidated by specimens that would have sent most visitors fleeing in terror. The Ashbluff family really outdid themselves when they agreed to let us visit, I said, noting how Rose's enthusiasm seemed to grow with each new discovery. Jean mentioned that they rarely allow outsiders access to their most prized specimens. I can understand why, Rose replied, pausing to examine a tree whose bark seemed to shift and flow like liquid shadow. Some of these plants represent centuries of careful breeding and magical cultivation. The knowledge required to maintain this ecosystem safely must be staggering. We reached the garden's centerpiece, a clearing where the most magnificent necromantic plants had been arranged around a small pavilion that seemed to exist in perfect harmony with the dangerous beauty surrounding it. Ancient trees formed a natural cathedral overhead, their shadow-touched leaves creating patterns of filtered darkness that made the entire space feel both intimate and otherworldly. Rose, I said, turning to face her as we stood in the center of this remarkable sanctuary. There's something I wanted to tell you in a setting that could match your own appreciation for the beauty that can emerge from understanding death magic. Her breath caught as she recognized the seriousness in my tone, her brown eyes reflecting both the garden's ethereal glow and something that looked remarkably like hope mixed with carefully controlled anticipation. Over the past few years, I continued, taking her hands in mine and feeling how they trembled slightly with emotion. You've shown me what it means to build something meaningful through patient dedication and strategic thinking. For down, 2 to go, Luna's amused voice echoed in my mind as I prepared for what would be one of the most personally meaningful proposals of the entire series. Though I have to admit, choosing to propose in a garden of death magic shows remarkable confidence in your romantic instincts. Your business brilliance, your magical expertise, your ability to see opportunities that others miss. They've made you an irreplaceable partner in everything I've built, I said, studying Rose's face as understanding began to dawn in her expression. But more than that, you've shown me what true partnership looks like. I released her hands and reached into my coat pocket, withdrawing the ring case that had been crafted specifically for this moment by artisans who specialized in magical items designed to work with necromantic energies. The case itself was made from Western shadowwood that seemed to absorb and hold darkness within its polished surface. You've been my advisor, my confidant, and my closest business partner, I continued, watching how her eyes grew wider as she realized what was happening. You've stood by every decision, supported every venture, and helped turn the Ouroboros Guild into something that neither of us could have achieved alone. The case opened to reveal a ring that represented weeks of careful design and collaboration with the most skilled magical craftsmen in the Western continent. The band was forged from pure etherite that had been infused with necromantic plant essences, creating a foundation that would enhance Rose's natural abilities while allowing her to bond more deeply with the magical flora she loved so much. The etherite had been colored to match her auburn hair perfectly, creating warm tones that seemed to pulse with life even while incorporating death magic principles. Embedded throughout the band were intricate nature motifs, leaves, vines, and flowers that seemed to move and grow across the ring's surface in response to magical energy. But it was the ring's most unique feature that made it truly special for someone of Rose's abilities. The etherite had been designed to form symbiotic bonds with necromantic plants, allowing her to communicate with and influence magical flora in ways that even traditional Springshaper techniques couldn't achieve. Rose Springshaper, I said, dropping to one knee in the center of the necromantic garden as the shadow-touched plants around us seemed to lean in with obvious interest. Would you do me the honor of becoming not just my wife, but my partner in building an empire that spans continents? Rose's reaction was immediate and characteristically thoughtful. Her brown eyes widened as she took in the ring's beauty and immediately grasped both its symbolic significance and its practical applications for her magical work. Arthur, she breathed, her usual business composure finally cracking to reveal the genuine emotion beneath. It's absolutely perfect. The magical integration alone must have cost a fortune. But the craftsmanship, this is museum-quality work. Because you deserve nothing less than perfection, I replied, slipping the ring onto her finger and watching as the etherite immediately began to resonate with her natural magical energy. And because I wanted something that could match both your business brilliance and your magical expertise. The ring settled onto her finger as if it had been waiting for her specifically, the auburn-colored etherite beginning to pulse with warm light that seemed to communicate with the necromantic plants surrounding us. Several nearby specimens actually began to bloom in response to the ring's magical emanations, creating a display of ethereal beauty that transformed the already impressive garden into something approaching pure magic. "Yes," Rose said clearly, her voice carrying the kind of decisive certainty that characterized all her most important business decisions. "Yes, Arthur, absolutely yes. I've been hoping for this moment longer than you probably realize." She pulled me to my feet and kissed me with the kind of passionate intensity that she rarely allowed herself to display in professional settings, her usual strategic control giving way to genuine emotional expression. The necromantic plants around us seemed to respond to our emotions, their magical emanations creating patterns of shadow and light that made the entire garden appear to celebrate our engagement. "I love you," she murmured against my lips. "But more than that, I respect what we've built together. This isn't just about marriage. It's about formalizing a partnership that's already changed both our lives." "Exactly," I agreed, holding her close as the magical plants continued their ethereal display around us. "Together, we can build something that will benefit not just ourselves, but everyone who depends on the guild for their livelihood and security." "The others don't know yet, do they?" Rose asked with characteristic business instincts, immediately recognizing the strategic timing of individual proposals. "You're managing this like a complex negotiation, ensuring each of us gets personal attention rather than feeling like part of a group transaction. Rachel, Cecilia, and Serafina have all been remarkably discreet about their own engagements," I confirmed with obvious admiration. "They understand that each relationship deserves its own recognition and celebration." "Smart women," Rose replied with genuine respect for her soon-to-be sister wives, "though I imagine they're all practically vibrating with excitement about finally getting to share the news." As we stood together in the necromantic garden, surrounded by magical plants that seemed to approve of our union, I felt the profound satisfaction that came from building something meaningful with someone who truly understood the scope of what we were attempting to achieve together. Chapter 775. 6 Engagements. 5. The penthouse garden had always been Reika's favorite place in our home. A private sanctuary high above the city, surrounded by the violet flowers that matched both her hair and eyes so perfectly. As I made final preparations for what would be the most emotionally significant proposal of the entire series, I found myself reflecting on how natural this setting felt for such an important moment. "She deserves to have this happen where it all began," I murmured to myself as I checked the garden's arrangement one final time, ensuring that every detail honored the depth of devotion she had shown me from the very beginning. The evening was perfect, warm enough to be comfortable in the garden's open air, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of violet blossoms throughout the space. I had spent hours ensuring that every detail was exactly right, because this proposal needed to honor not just our relationship, but the unwavering loyalty that Reika had demonstrated from our very first interaction. Stella was also with my parents for now. "Arthur?" came her soft voice from the garden entrance, carrying that note of curious anticipation that always made my heart race. "You said you wanted to spend the evening here together?" I turned to see her silhouetted against the penthouse's elegant interior lighting, wearing a simple but beautiful dress in deep violet that seemed designed to complement both the garden's flowers and her own remarkable coloring. Her violet hair caught the evening light in ways that made it appear almost luminescent, while her flower-like eyes held the kind of wondering curiosity that made my chest tighten with protective tenderness. "I did," I confirmed, moving toward her with the kind of easy familiarity that came from years of shared intimacy. "This place has always been special to us." I thought it was time to add another important memory to its history. Reika's expression grew more curious as she stepped into the garden proper, her eyes taking in the careful arrangements I had made. Additional violet flowers positioned to create natural pathways, soft lighting that enhanced rather than overwhelmed the space's natural beauty, and the small table set with her favorite evening refreshments. "You've gone to a lot of trouble," she observed with obvious pleasure, moving deeper into the garden with the graceful confidence that characterized her behavior in spaces where she felt completely secure. "This looks like you're planning something special." "Very special," I agreed, watching how the garden's violet blooms seemed to respond to her presence with subtle shifts in their magical emanations. Reika, do you remember the first time you told me how you felt about me? Her cheeks flushed with the kind of deep rose color that always made my heart race, her violet eyes growing brighter as she recalled that pivotal moment in our relationship. Right here, she said softly, gesturing toward the section of the garden where she had first confessed her feelings with trembling courage. I was so nervous I could barely speak, but I knew I had to tell you the truth about how completely you had captured my heart. And do you remember what I told you in response? I asked, moving closer to her among the violet flowers that seemed to bloom more vibrantly in her presence. You said that my honesty was one of the most beautiful gifts anyone had ever given you, Reika replied, her voice carrying the kind of warm emotion that suggested she treasured that memory as much as I did. You said that my willingness to be vulnerable showed a kind of courage that impressed you more than any display of power or skill. I meant every word, I said with conviction that made her eyes shine with unshed tears. Your courage, your honesty, your absolute devotion. They've been the foundation that made everything else in my life possible. 5 down, 1 to go. Luna's voice echoed in my mind with obvious satisfaction. Though I have to say, saving the most emotionally devoted for second to last shows excellent understanding of dramatic pacing. Reika, I continued, taking her hands in mine and feeling how they trembled slightly with emotion. Over the years since that first confession, you've shown me what unconditional love actually means, not just in words but in actions, in how you've supported every decision, trusted every choice, stood by me through every challenge. Her violet eyes grew wider as she recognized the direction this conversation was taking, her entire body beginning to tremble with the kind of overwhelming emotion that she had never learned to control around me. You've been my anchor, I said, studying her face as tears began to gather in those extraordinary eyes. The one person I could always count on to understand not just what I was trying to achieve, but why it mattered to me. You've never asked me to change or compromise or be anything other than exactly who I am. I released her hands and reached into my coat pocket, withdrawing the ring case that had been crafted with more personal attention and detailed customization than any of the others. This case was carved from violet crystal that seemed to pulse with the same gentle light that characterized Reika's magical aura, creating a container that was beautiful enough to be treasured in its own right. You've given me the gift of being completely accepted, I continued, watching how her tears began to spill down her cheeks as understanding dawned. The freedom to be vulnerable without fear, to share my thoughts and feelings and dreams without worrying about judgment or rejection. The case opened to reveal a ring that represented not just weeks of design work, but years of understanding what would be most meaningful to someone whose entire world revolved around our relationship. The band was forged from pure etherite that had been shaped and colored to match her violet hair perfectly, creating a foundation that would enhance her natural magical abilities while symbolizing the perfect harmony between us. But it was the ring's centerpiece that made it truly special for Reika specifically. Instead of a traditional gemstone, the etherite had been crafted into the shape of her signature flower, the rare violet blossom that bloomed only in the most carefully tended magical gardens. Every petal was carved with such precision that the flower appeared to be alive, seeming to move and sway in response to magical energy. The magical properties embedded within the design would allow Reika to channel her natural abilities with unprecedented effectiveness, while also creating a bond between us that would enable perfect emotional synchronization, the ultimate expression of the devotion she had always shown me. Reika, I said, dropping to one knee in the center of the garden where she had first confessed her love, surrounded by the violet flowers that had witnessed the beginning of our relationship. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Her reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Her hands flew to cover her mouth as tears began streaming down her cheeks in earnest, her entire body shaking with emotion that seemed too intense to contain within such a delicate frame. Yes, she sobbed, the word barely audible through her tears. Yes, yes, of course yes. Arthur, I've dreamed of this moment every day since I first told you I loved you. I slipped the ring onto her finger, watching as the violet etherite immediately began to resonate with her natural magical energy in ways that made the flower-shaped centerpiece appear to bloom with actual life. The effect was so realistic that several of the garden's actual violet flowers began responding to the ring's emanations, creating a cascade of blooming that transformed the entire space into something approaching pure magic. "Arthur?" Rekha whispered, staring at the ring through her tears. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. How did you know to make it look exactly like my favorite flower?" "Because I've been paying attention to everything that makes you happy," I replied, pulling her into my arms as she continued to shake with overwhelming emotion. "Because every detail of who you are matters to me." She buried her face against my chest, her words muffled but still clearly audible as she spoke through her tears. "I love you so much it frightens me sometimes. You're everything I ever dreamed of finding in another person, and I still can't believe you chose me." "Rekha," I said firmly, tilting her chin up so she had to meet my eyes. "You were never a choice I had to make. You were a gift I was lucky enough to receive. Your love, your devotion, your absolute faith in me. They've made me a better person than I ever thought I could be. I would do anything for you," she said with the kind of absolute conviction that characterized everything about our relationship. "Follow you anywhere, support any decision, stand by you through any challenge. You're not just the man I love. You're the center of my entire world." The intensity of her devotion was both humbling and deeply moving. Rekha's love wasn't just emotional. It was existential, encompassing not just her feelings but her fundamental sense of purpose and identity. "And I promise you," I replied with matching conviction, "that I will never take that devotion for granted. Your love is the most precious thing in my life, and I will spend every day trying to be worthy of it." As we held each other in the garden where our relationship had first become real, surrounded by violet flowers that seemed to celebrate our engagement with their ethereal blooming, I felt the profound satisfaction that came from honoring someone whose love had been absolute and unwavering from the very beginning. "Arthur," Rekha said softly, her voice still thick with happy tears, "when do we tell everyone? I want the whole world to know that I'm going to be your wife." "Soon," I promised, kissing the top of her head as she nestled against my chest. "Very soon. Everyone will know exactly how lucky I am to have you in my life." The fifth proposal was complete, and it had honored the depth of devotion that had made our relationship a foundation for everything else I had built. Only one more remained. Chapter 776. 6 Engagements. 6. The Astoria Healing Gardens in the early morning light were exactly as beautiful as I remembered from our first walk together. Carefully cultivated medicinal plants arranged in patterns that created both aesthetic beauty and practical accessibility for someone dedicated to the healing arts. As I made final preparations for what would be the most delicate proposal of the entire series, I found myself reflecting on how much this relationship had evolved from its strategic origins. She deserves to be treated with the same respect and ceremony as the others, I murmured to myself as I checked the garden's peaceful atmosphere one final time. Regardless of how our relationship began, she's agreed to become my wife, and that deserves to be honored properly. The morning was perfect, warm enough to be comfortable among the healing plants, with a gentle breeze that carried the therapeutic scents of rare medicinal herbs throughout the space. I had spent considerable time ensuring that every detail reflected both Alara's interests and the dignity she deserved, because this proposal needed to transform what had started as a strategic arrangement into something that felt genuinely meaningful. "Arthur?" came her soft voice from the garden entrance, carrying that note of curious warmth that had characterized our interactions from the beginning. "You said you wanted to show me something special in the healing gardens?" I turned to see her approaching with the graceful confidence that had made her such a respected figure throughout the empire, wearing a simple but elegant dress in pale blue that complemented both her golden hair and the garden's natural beauty. Her violet eyes held the kind of intelligent curiosity that had drawn me to her personality from our very first conversation. "I did," I confirmed, moving toward her with the respectful familiarity that had developed between us over the months of courtship. "There's something I wanted to share with you in the place where we first really talked about your vision for the future." Alara's expression grew more curious as she stepped deeper into the healing garden, her eyes taking in the careful arrangements I had made. additional rare medicinal plants positioned to create natural focal points, soft morning light that enhanced rather than overwhelmed the space's therapeutic atmosphere, and the small seating area where we could speak privately. "You've been very thoughtful about the setting," she observed with obvious appreciation, moving deeper into the garden with the confident knowledge that characterized her behavior around healing plants. "This does feel like an appropriate place for important conversations." "Very important," I agreed, watching how the healing plants seemed to respond to her presence with subtle shifts in their magical emanations. "Alara, do you remember what we discussed the first time we walked through these gardens together?" Her violet eyes brightened with the memory, a genuine smile crossing her features as she recalled that pivotal conversation. "You asked about my ideas for applying healing principles to social problems," she said warmly. "You were the first person who took those theories seriously instead of dismissing them as impractical idealism. And you shared your vision for preventing conflicts before they escalate into violence," I replied, noting how her expression grew more thoughtful as she remembered the depth of that discussion. "You talked about addressing root causes rather than just treating symptoms." "I still believe in those principles," Alara said with quiet conviction. "In fact, our recent conversations have helped me refine some of those ideas further. Your perspective on practical implementation has been invaluable." "Six down, mission accomplished," Luna's voice echoed in my mind with obvious satisfaction. "Though I have to say, treating this final proposal with the same dignity as the romantic ones shows excellent understanding of what respect actually means." "Alara," I continued, taking her hands in mine with the careful respect that had characterized our entire relationship. "Over the months since we first met, you've shown me what true wisdom looks like. Not just intelligence, but the kind of deep understanding that comes from genuinely caring about other people's well-being." Her violet eyes grew wider as she recognized the direction this conversation was taking, though her expression held curiosity and appreciation rather than the overwhelming emotion that had characterized the other proposals. "You've taught me that strength doesn't have to come from power over others," I said, studying her face as understanding began to dawn. "That the most important changes happen when people feel heard and respected rather than controlled or manipulated." I released her hands and reached into my coat pocket, withdrawing the ring case that had been crafted with careful attention to both her preferences and the unique nature of our relationship. The case was made from pure white crystal that seemed to glow with its own internal light, creating a container that reflected both purity and strength. "You've shown me what it means to approach problems with compassion rather than force," I continued, watching how her expression grew more amazed as she realized what was happening. "To seek solutions that heal rather than simply achieving victory." The case opened to reveal a ring that represented weeks of careful design focused on honoring both Alara's healing abilities and the dignity she deserved as my future wife. The band was forged from pure white etherite that had been shaped to resemble the delicate medical instruments she used in her healing work, creating a foundation that would enhance her natural abilities while symbolizing the important work she was meant to accomplish. Accenting the white etherite were delicate violet traces that seemed to flow through the band like veins of healing energy, their color chosen to match her eyes while representing the life force that she dedicated her abilities to protecting and nurturing. The magical properties embedded within the design would allow Alara to channel her healing magic with unprecedented precision and effectiveness, while also providing protection against any magical attacks that might target her because of her connection to me. It was both a tool for the work she loved and a symbol of the protection I was promising to provide. "Alara Astoria," I said, dropping to one knee in the center of the healing garden where we had first discovered our intellectual compatibility, surrounded by the medicinal plants that represented her life's passion. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Her reaction was measured but genuinely pleased, her violet eyes reflecting both the ring's beauty and obvious appreciation for the thoughtfulness that had gone into every detail. Unlike the overwhelming emotion that had characterized the other proposals, this moment held a quality of mutual respect and shared understanding. "Arthur," she said softly, her voice carrying warm gratitude rather than passionate love, "it's absolutely beautiful. You've managed to create something that honors both my work and the dignity of what we're undertaking together." Because you deserve to be treated with the same respect and ceremony as anyone else who agrees to share my life, I replied, slipping the ring onto her finger and watching as the white etherite immediately began to resonate with her natural healing energy. Regardless of how our relationship began, you're choosing to become my wife, and that deserves to be honored properly. The ring settled onto her finger as if it had been designed specifically for her, the white etherite beginning to pulse with gentle light that seemed to enhance the healing properties of the plants around us. The violet accents caught the morning light and reflected it back in patterns that made her hand appear to be surrounded by therapeutic energy. "Thank you," Alara said clearly, her voice carrying sincere appreciation for both the ring and the gesture it represented. "Not just for the proposal or the ring, though both are wonderful. Thank you for treating me like a real partner rather than just a political convenience." She leaned forward and kissed me gently on the cheek, the gesture holding warmth and affection without the passionate intensity that characterized my relationships with the others. It was exactly right for what we were building together. A partnership based on mutual respect and shared goals rather than romantic love. "I'm honored to accept," she continued with obvious sincerity. "Not just because of what this prevents, but because I genuinely believe we can build something meaningful together. Your support for my ideas, your willingness to listen to my perspectives, they've shown me what true partnership can look like. And I'm honored that you've agreed to take this journey with me," I replied with matching sincerity. "Your wisdom, your compassion, your vision for making the world better, they're exactly what I need to become the kind of person worthy of the responsibilities I'm taking on." As we stood together in the healing garden, surrounded by plants dedicated to nurturing and protecting life, I felt the profound satisfaction that came from treating someone with the dignity they deserved regardless of the strategic necessities that had brought us together. "When do we tell everyone?" Alara asked with practical curiosity rather than emotional urgency. "I imagine coordinating the announcement of 6 simultaneous engagements will require considerable diplomatic finesse." "Very soon," I promised, appreciating how her mind immediately moved to the practical considerations involved. "Though I suspect the political ramifications are going to be interesting regardless of how carefully we manage the timing." "Indeed," Alara replied with obvious thoughtfulness about the broader implications. 6 wives representing different continents and magical traditions. The alliance structure alone will reshape international politics for generations. The 6th and final proposal was complete, and it had honored the dignity of someone who had agreed to share my life while maintaining the respectful partnership that made our unique relationship both meaningful and sustainable. All 6 promises had been made. Now the real work of building our shared future could begin. Chapter 777. Public 1. The Imperial Trade Summit was one of those mandatory political events that I had learned to navigate with practiced efficiency. A gathering of the Empire's most influential business leaders, guild representatives, and political figures designed to showcase economic achievements while providing networking opportunities for the powerful. As Guild Grandmaster, my presence was not just expected but essential, particularly given the Ouroboros Guild's recent expansion into all 5 continents. What made this summit different from previous years was the subtle weight I felt on my hands as I moved through the elegant reception hall, greeting dignitaries and discussing trade agreements. 6 rings adorned my fingers, each one a masterpiece of magical craftsmanship that represented promises made and futures intertwined in ways that would reshape the political landscape of the known world. Grandmaster Nightingale called Minister Blackwood as I approached a group of senior trade officials. "Congratulations on the Guild's remarkable expansion. The quarterly reports show growth that exceeds even our most optimistic projections." "Thank you, Minister," I replied, accepting the handshake while noting how his eyes briefly flickered to my hands before returning to my face. Strategic partnerships and careful planning tend to produce sustainable results. The conversation continued for several minutes, covering topics ranging from magical goods transportation to international currency exchange rates. But I noticed how Minister Blackwood's attention kept drifting to my rings, his expression growing increasingly puzzled as he tried to process what he was seeing. Similar reactions occurred throughout the evening as I made my rounds through the summit's various presentations and networking sessions. Subtle glances, double takes, whispered conversations that ceased when I approached. The kind of behavior that suggested people were noticing something unusual but hadn't quite pieced together what it meant. The first breakthrough came during the formal dinner portion of the evening, when I was seated at the head table alongside other guild leaders and senior imperial officials. The lighting was bright enough for detailed observation, and the prolonged seating arrangement gave people ample time to study the intricate details of each ring. "My word," murmured Lady Ashworth, seated to my right. "Those are some remarkable rings, Grandmaster. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. Each one appears to be a unique masterpiece." "They are," I confirmed with carefully controlled casualness. "Each one designed for a very specific purpose and recipient." What I didn't mention was that similar conversations were likely occurring at events across all 5 continents. Rachel would be attending a northern diplomatic gathering, her Aurora-inspired ring catching light in ways that would draw inevitable attention. Cecilia would be present at imperial functions throughout the week, her flame-wreathed band impossible to miss during formal ceremonies. Serafina would be representing Eastern interests at trade negotiations, her ice crystal design standing out against traditional Eastern jewelry. Rose would be managing Springshaper business operations, her living necromantic ring responding to magical plants in ways that would fascinate botanical experts. And Alara would be attending noble meetups, her pure white band glowing with therapeutic energy that would intrigue medical professionals. The breakthrough moment came when young Lord Pemberton, recently returned from diplomatic missions to multiple continents, suddenly straightened in his chair with obvious recognition. "Those rings," he said loudly enough to draw attention from nearby tables. "I've seen similar designs recently." The northern delegation Saintis was wearing something remarkably similar during trade negotiations last week. And the Eastern princess had a ring that seemed to share design elements with one of yours. The revelation hit the assembled dignitaries like a magical explosion. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as people processed the implications of what Lord Pemberton had observed. If the guild grandmaster was wearing rings that matched those worn by princesses and other high-ranking nobles from multiple continents. 6 rings? Whispered someone from across the table. And 6 different design styles that correspond to. The unfinished sentence hung in the air as understanding dawned across the dining hall. Magical communication devices appeared in hands throughout the room as people frantically contacted associates on other continents to confirm what they suspected they were witnessing. Within minutes, the confirmation came back through multiple channels. Yes, Princess Rachel Creighton was wearing a northern-style ring that matched one of the grandmasters. Yes, Crown Princess Cecilia Slatemark had been seen with a flame-themed band identical to another of his rings. Yes, Princess Serafina had displayed Eastern ice crystal jewelry that corresponded perfectly to a 3rd ring. Yes, Lady Rose Springshaper's necromantic ring shared clear design elements with a 4th. And yes, Lady Alara Astoria had been observed wearing healing-focused jewelry that matched the 5th. The 6th ring's significance became clear when people remembered my unique romantic situation. Reika, whose violet-flowered ring would complete the set of 6 simultaneous engagements that represented the most unprecedented political alliance in modern history. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said clearly, rising from my seat as the entire dining hall fell silent with anticipation. "I believe you've discovered something that was always intended to become public knowledge, though perhaps not quite this dramatically." The silence stretched for several heartbeats before erupting into a cacophony of voices, questions, and urgent magical communications as the assembled dignitaries grappled with the implications of what they had witnessed. 6 engagements announced not through formal declaration but through the simple act of wearing rings that proclaimed alliances spanning continents. I remained at the summit for another hour, answering what questions I could while deflecting others with diplomatic skill. But as the evening wound down and I prepared to depart, I felt the profound satisfaction that came from successfully executing a plan that would reshape international politics without requiring dramatic proclamations or formal ceremonies. The ride home gave me time to prepare for conversations that would be far more personally meaningful than any political maneuvering. My family deserved to hear about these developments directly from me, rather than discovering them through news reports or social gossip. "Arthur," my mother called as I entered the penthouse. "How was the summit? You look like something significant happened." Something very significant, I confirmed, settling into the living room where both my parents were reviewing their own business correspondence. I need to tell you about some decisions I've made regarding my personal life. What followed was a 20-minute explanation of the 6 engagements, the political implications, and the strategic necessities that had driven these choices. My parents listened with the kind of careful attention that characterized their approach to any major family development. We soon heard the sound of running footsteps as Stella appeared in the living room doorway, clearly having overheard enough of our conversation to understand its basic implications. "Daddy!" she exclaimed with 9-year-old excitement. "Does this mean I'm going to have 6 mommies? Real mommies who will teach me things and help with homework and maybe take me shopping?" The innocent enthusiasm in her voice made my chest tighten with affection. "Yes, Stella. 6 very smart, very kind women who are all looking forward to being part of our family. That's the best news ever," Stella declared, launching herself at me for a hug that nearly knocked me off balance. "Can I meet them all soon? I want to show them my math projects, and maybe they can teach me about magic and other continents and healing and all sorts of things." As I held my delighted daughter while my parents exchanged amused glances, I reflected on how different perspectives could transform the same situation from complex political maneuvering into simple family expansion. For Stella, 6 new family members meant 6 new sources of attention, education, and affection. Perhaps her perspective was the most accurate of all. The rings had done their work. By tomorrow, the revelation would be international news, reshaping diplomatic relationships across all 5 continents. But tonight, it was simply good news shared with the people who mattered most. Chapter 778. Public 2. The news reached me through official diplomatic channels at precisely the same time it arrived via emergency magical communication from my mother, which told me everything I needed to know about the magnitude of what Arthur had just accomplished. Sitting in my private study at the Northern Palace, I found myself staring at reports that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. Arthur Nightingale, my friend, rival, and one of the few people whose political instincts I genuinely respected, had just announced engagements to 6 women simultaneously. Rachel Creighton, the saintess I had grown up alongside, Cecilia, Serafina, Rose, Reka, and Alara. "Magnificent bastard," I murmured with genuine admiration, setting down the official report to pour myself a drink that the situation clearly warranted. He didn't just make strategic marriages. He created a world alliance that makes him untouchable. The political implications were staggering. Arthur now had direct marital connections to 3 of the 6 superpowers, plus a marquis and an archduke within the Slatemark Empire itself. The Ouroboros Guild's economic influence combined with these political alliances made Arthur arguably the most powerful non-royal individual in the known world. And he was my friend, which meant the northern continent had just gained an invaluable ally without needing to sacrifice anything in return. "Lucifer?" came Ciola's composed voice from the study entrance, though I caught an undercurrent of excitement that suggested she had heard the news as well. "Might we join you? This seems like the kind of development that warrants discussion." I turned to see both Ciola and Dia entering with expressions that mixed genuine curiosity about the political ramifications with something that looked suspiciously like expectation. Ciola moved with her characteristic grace, her dark hair perfectly arranged despite the late hour. Dia followed with less formal composure, her red hair slightly disheveled as if she had been pacing while processing the news. "Of course," I replied, gesturing for them to take seats near my desk where they could review the reports themselves. "I assume you've both heard about Arthur's comprehensive approach to matrimonial alliances." 6 engagements announced simultaneously, Dia said with obvious amazement, settling into her chair with the kind of restless energy that characterized her response to major developments. "I've never heard of anything like it. The political coordination alone must have required months of planning. The economic implications are extraordinary," Ciola added with the analytical precision that made her such an effective advisor. "The Ouroboros Guild now has royal backing from 3 continents plus significant noble support within the Slatemark Empire. Arthur's influence just increased even more." I nodded in agreement, though part of my attention was focused on how both women kept glancing at me with expressions that suggested they were thinking about more than just political analysis. The timing of their expectant looks, combined with the nature of Arthur's announcement, made their thoughts fairly transparent. I have to admit, I said honestly, I'm genuinely impressed by his strategic thinking. Creating 6 simultaneous engagements rather than sequential ones prevents any appearance of favoring one relationship over others while maximizing the political impact of the announcement. And you're happy for them? Dia asked with the kind of direct curiosity that had always characterized her approach to complex situations. For Rachel and the others, this isn't just politics for them. These are real relationships with someone they care about. The question touched on something that mattered more to me than the political calculations. Rachel had been my friend since childhood, someone whose happiness I genuinely cared about regardless of strategic considerations. Knowing that she had found someone who appreciated her intelligence and dedication rather than simply using her for political advantage was deeply satisfying. I'm genuinely happy for Rachel, I replied with conviction that made both women smile. She's been in love with Arthur for years, and he loves her as well. What I didn't mention was my suspicion that Arthur's pursuit of Alara had been motivated by knowledge or considerations that went beyond normal courtship patterns. But that was speculation rather than confirmed fact, and Arthur's personal motivations were his own business as long as they didn't threaten northern interests. 6 wives representing different continents and magical traditions, Siola observed thoughtfully. The alliance structure alone will reshape international politics for generations. Arthur has positioned himself at the center of a network that could influence everything from trade agreements to military cooperation. Indeed, I agreed, though I was becoming increasingly aware of how both women kept glancing at me with expressions that had nothing to do with political analysis. The northern continent benefits significantly from having such strong connections to Arthur's expanding influence. Lucifer, Dia said with the kind of direct approach that had always characterized her personality. Aren't you going to comment on the most obvious aspect of Arthur's announcement? Which aspect specifically? I asked, though I suspected I knew exactly what she meant. 6 proposals, Siola said with a meaningful look that confirmed my suspicions. 6 different women who all received formal marriage proposals from someone they care about. 6 rings that represent commitment and shared futures. The expectation in their voices was unmistakable now. Arthur's dramatic announcement of 6 simultaneous engagements had clearly inspired thoughts about proposals and marriage commitments in the minds of my own romantic partners. I see, I said carefully, noting how both women were watching my reaction with obvious interest. And you're thinking that Arthur's approach to formalizing his relationships might serve as inspiration for other romantic situations? We're thinking, Dia replied with a smile that combined affection with gentle pressure, that if your friend can commit to 6 women simultaneously, perhaps you could consider committing to 2 women who have been remarkably patient about the question of marriage. The comment was delivered with humor, but the underlying message was clear. Arthur's bold move had raised expectations about formal commitments throughout our social circle. Both Siola and Dia had been understanding about my cautious approach to marriage proposals, but witnessing their friend receive such dramatic romantic recognition had clearly inspired thoughts about their own relationship status. That's a fair point, I admitted with a rueful smile. Arthur has certainly raised the bar for romantic gestures. 6 custom-designed rings, 6 personalized proposals, 6 different women all formally committed to sharing his future. He has, Siola agreed with obvious satisfaction at my acknowledgement. Though we're not expecting anything quite so elaborate. 2 rings, 2 proposals, 2 women who are already completely committed to sharing your future. That seems much more manageable. Looking at these 2 remarkable women who had chosen to build their lives around our relationship, I felt the familiar combination of affection and responsibility that characterized my feelings for both of them. Arthur's announcement had been impressive from both political and personal perspectives, but it had also highlighted how my own cautious approach to marriage might be creating unnecessary uncertainty for people who deserved better. You're absolutely right, I said with growing conviction about what needed to happen next. If Arthur can commit to 6 women who will help him build an empire, I should certainly be able to commit to 2 women who are already helping me prepare to rule a continent. The delighted expressions on both their faces told me everything I needed to know about how long they had been hoping for this conversation. Arthur's dramatic announcement had accomplished more than just reshaping international politics. It had inspired romantic developments that would ripple through our entire social circle. So, Dia said with obvious excitement, when should we expect these hypothetical proposals to become less hypothetical? Soon, I promised, meaning it completely. Very soon. Arthur has reminded me that the most important commitments shouldn't be delayed by political convenience or strategic timing. As we sat together in my study, reviewing reports about Arthur's unprecedented announcement while discussing our own romantic future, I reflected on how my friend's bold move had created opportunities for everyone in his orbit. The political implications would dominate international headlines for months, but the personal implications might prove even more significant in the long run. Arthur had changed the game for all of us, and it was time to follow his example. Chapter 779. Public 3. The news reached me through my carefully maintained network of digital informants at precisely the moment Arthur Nightingale announced his political masterstroke to the world. 6 engagements, 6 rings, 6 women who now represented the most comprehensive alliance structure in modern political history. And one of those women was supposed to be mine. I sat in my private study, staring at the secure tablet that had delivered this devastating intelligence through encrypted channels, feeling something cold and furious unfurl in my chest. The live stream of the Imperial Trade Summit was still playing on my wall display, showing Arthur's composed face as reporters bombarded him with questions about the unprecedented announcement. Arthur had taken everything, not just the woman who was supposed to be my path to greater influence, but the entire strategic landscape I had been so carefully constructing. Elara Astoria, I murmured, her name carrying a bitter taste that I hadn't expected. The perfect asset, now completely beyond reach. That was what she had been, after all. An asset, a means to an end. The pure-hearted support mage and healer whose influence could have opened doors that raw power alone could never breach. Her reputation for absolute moral integrity made her invaluable for someone who needed to operate in shadows while maintaining public respectability. But Arthur had seen her value too, and his positioning had been superior from the beginning. While I had been subtle, he had been direct. While I had been calculating the perfect moment to strike, he had been building genuine rapport. While I had been treating the courtship as a strategic campaign, he had apparently been winning her actual affection. The memory surfaced unbidden, sharp and unwelcome in its clarity. 3 years ago, during one of the cultural exhibitions where I had been carefully studying Elara's responses to different stimuli, measuring her reactions to determine the most effective approaches for future manipulation. She had been standing before a display of war orphan artwork, her violet eyes reflecting the pain and hope captured in childish drawings of families torn apart by conflict. I had positioned myself nearby, observing how she processed emotional information, cataloging her responses for strategic reference. "It's heartbreaking," she had said softly, not realizing I was close enough to hear. Her voice carried genuine anguish that couldn't be manufactured or performed. "These children have lost everything, but they're still dreaming of love and safety." I had watched her discreetly transfer funds through her personal banking app, not some official charitable account, but her own money, quietly arranging for the purchase of several drawings. Not for herself, but to ensure the orphans received fair compensation for their work. The transaction was handled with such discretion that no one else even noticed her generosity. Perfect, I had thought, analyzing the strategic implications. This was exactly the kind of authentic compassion that could be leveraged, the genuine goodness that would make her trust whatever guidance I chose to provide. Her pure heart would be the key to everything I was building. She was perfect for my purposes, nothing more. The memory faded, leaving me staring at news coverage of Arthur's triumph with hands clenched into fists. That moment of weakness, that brief instant where I had almost allowed myself to be distracted by sentiment. It was exactly the kind of vulnerability that Arthur had exploited to maximum advantage. He had seen what I had seen, Elara's genuine goodness, her authentic compassion, her ability to inspire trust and loyalty through simple human decency. But where I had recognized a tool to be acquired and employed, Arthur had apparently seen something worth protecting and cherishing. And now she was lost to me forever. The political implications were staggering. Arthur's six-way alliance made him virtually untouchable through conventional means. His connection to three superpowers, plus significant noble support within the Slatemark Empire itself, created a defensive network that could weather almost any political storm. But more than that, he had stolen the centerpiece of my own careful planning. Elara wasn't just another alliance. She was the moral authority that could have legitimized everything else I intended to accomplish. Her endorsement would have opened doors that money and threats could never breach. Another memory surfaced. Watching her through security footage from the city medical center, tending to injured civilians after a magical accident. The way she had worked tirelessly for hours, asking nothing in return, refusing any offers of compensation or recognition despite being the daughter of an Archduke way more worthy than dirtying her hands with those filthy commoners. I had been analyzing her technique through the feeds, noting how her healing magic seemed more effective than it should be based on pure power levels. It was her emotional investment in each patient that made the difference. She poured genuine care into every spell, every treatment, every moment of contact. Remarkable efficiency. I had murmured to myself, genuinely impressed despite the clinical nature of my observation, not just by her magical abilities, but by the way she made everyone around her feel valued and protected. This was exactly what I needed. Someone whose very presence elevated everyone's perception of moral authority. Now Arthur had claimed that dedication for himself and his alliance. 6 rings, 6 commitments, 6 women who would reshape the political landscape while remaining forever beyond my reach. My secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from the Order. The elders had been monitoring the situation and wanted immediate consultation about revised strategies. As the heir to the Order of Fallen Flame, my personal failures reflected on the organization's entire long-term planning. I moved to my private safe, retrieving certain encrypted drives that contained information I had hoped never to need in civilized society. But Arthur's move had been too comprehensive, too devastating to counter through conventional methods. If political maneuvering could no longer achieve my objectives, then other approaches would be necessary. The Order had been remarkably patient with my gradual infiltration of high society, understanding that certain goals required subtle long-term positioning rather than dramatic short-term action. But circumstances had changed, and patience was no longer a luxury I could afford. Arthur Nightingale thought he had outmaneuvered me completely. He believed his political alliances made him untouchable, his reputation unassailable, his position secure. He had stolen the woman who should have been my path to legitimacy and turned her into yet another pillar supporting his growing empire. But there were other kinds of power than political influence, other methods of destroying enemies than social maneuvering, other ways of claiming victory than building alliances. I began typing coded messages that would set certain plans in motion, plans that had been held in reserve for exactly this kind of desperate situation. Arthur had forced my hand by taking everything I had worked toward, but he had also given me the justification I needed to abandon subtlety entirely. The artifacts in my vault hummed with barely contained demonic energy as I made my preparations. Such power was dangerous to wield, but it was also devastatingly effective when properly applied. Arthur's political network couldn't protect him from accusations that struck at the very foundation of civilized society. Let him enjoy his 6 rings and his continental alliances. Let him bask in the momentary triumph of outmaneuvering someone he thought was merely a political rival. Soon enough, he would learn that some enemies couldn't be defeated through clever positioning and strategic marriages. As I sent the final encrypted message and began preparing the tools that would reshape this entire game, I felt my eyes darkening with the kind of cold determination that had carried me through every obstacle in my path. Arthur Nightingale had just made the last mistake of his life. Chapter 780. Civil War? 1. The emergency session of the Imperial Council was called under the pretense of addressing concerns about foreign influence in domestic affairs. But I knew exactly what Valerian was attempting. My brother had never been subtle about his machinations, and his current desperation made him even more transparent than usual. As Crown Princess and heir to the Slatemark Empire, I sat at the council table with the kind of composed confidence that came from knowing I held superior cards in whatever game Valerian thought he was playing. Around the table, the Empire's most senior nobles and advisors shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware that they were about to witness a confrontation between imperial siblings with very different visions for the Empire's future. "Your Highness," Marquis Blackmore said carefully, addressing Valerian with the respect due his imperial blood while obviously choosing his words with extreme caution. "Perhaps you could elaborate on the specific concerns that prompted this urgent gathering?" Valerian stood with the kind of dramatic flair he had always favored when making what he considered important proclamations. Despite being stripped of his position in the succession, he still carried himself with imperial bearing, still believed his opinions carried weight simply because of his bloodline. "Fellow nobles," he began, his voice carrying the practiced charm that had once made him popular among certain social circles. "I have called you here to address a threat to the very foundation of our empire's independence and sovereignty." I watched him with analytical precision, cataloging every gesture, every inflection, every calculated pause. Valerian had always been skilled at reading audiences and tailoring his message accordingly, but his current desperation was making him sloppy. "The Guild Grandmaster," Valerian continued, his voice growing stronger as he sensed the attention of his audience, "has acquired an unprecedented level of foreign influence through strategic marriages that compromise our empire's ability to act independently." Several nobles shifted uncomfortably at this direct attack on Arthur, while others leaned forward with obvious interest. I noted who was reacting positively to Valerian's rhetoric, information that would prove useful for future political calculations. "6 wives representing foreign powers," Valerian pressed on, his tone growing more urgent. "2 princesses from rival superpowers, plus significant noble alliances within our own borders." This man now commands loyalty networks that span continents, resources that rival national treasuries, and influence that could override imperial authority itself. The accusations were cleverly crafted to appeal to nationalist sentiment and concerns about foreign manipulation. Valerian was positioning Arthur not as a successful businessman who had built valuable international relationships, but as a threat to imperial sovereignty who had compromised the empire's independence through excessive foreign entanglements. "Furthermore," Valerian continued, warming to his theme, "one of these marriages involves Lady Ilara Astoria, daughter of Archduke Leopold, a woman who was being considered for marriage within the imperial family itself. This represents not just political overreach, but a direct challenge to imperial prerogatives." Now we were getting to the heart of his grievance. Valerian wasn't concerned about imperial sovereignty. He was furious about losing Ilara to someone he considered beneath his status. This was personal vendetta disguised as patriotic concern. I let him continue for several more minutes, allowing him to fully commit to his position, while the assembled nobles revealed their own inclinations through body language and subtle reactions. When he finally paused for effect, I rose from my seat with deliberate calm. "Brother," I said clearly, my voice carrying the kind of imperial authority that had been trained into me since childhood, "your concerns about foreign influence are noted. However, I believe there are some factual corrections that need to be addressed." The shift in the room's atmosphere was immediate. Where Valerian had been playing to emotions and prejudices, everyone knew I would be presenting cold political analysis backed by verifiable facts. "First," I continued, moving around the table with the kind of controlled grace that commanded attention, "the marriages you describe as foreign influence actually represent unprecedented opportunities for the Slatemark Empire to extend its own influence across all 5 continents." I gestured toward a wall display that showed detailed economic projections. The Ouroboros Guild's operations, now backed by alliances from 3 superpowers, create trade opportunities and diplomatic leverage that benefit our empire directly. Rather than compromising our independence, these relationships enhance our global position. Several nobles nodded as they processed the economic implications. These were practical people who understood the value of profitable alliances, regardless of their personal feelings about Arthur or marriage politics. "Second," I continued, my voice growing colder as I addressed the core of Valerian's grievance, "your suggestion that Lady Ilara was being considered for imperial marriage is misleading. No formal negotiations were ever initiated, no agreements were ever reached, and no commitments were ever made. Your personal disappointment does not constitute a legitimate political grievance. The direct challenge hit home. Valerian's face flushed with anger and embarrassment as I publicly dismissed his claims to Alara while revealing the personal nature of his motivations. Third, I said, allowing a note of steel to enter my voice as I prepared to destroy his position completely, your characterization of Grandmaster Nightingale as a threat to imperial authority ignores the reality that he has consistently supported imperial interests, enhanced our economic position, and strengthened our international relationships. I paused, letting the silence stretch as I studied Valerian's increasingly desperate expression. It was time to remind him of certain truths he had apparently forgotten. "Valerian," I said quietly, using the tone that had once reduced him to tears during our childhood confrontations. "Do you remember the last time you challenged my judgment in front of witnesses?" The color drained from his face as the memory surfaced. He was 12, I was 10, and he had made the mistake of publicly questioning my competence during a family gathering. What followed had been a systematic dismantling of his arguments, his credibility, and his confidence that had left him sobbing in front of relatives and advisors. "I remember explaining to you then," I continued with deadly calm, "that challenging my positions without proper preparation would always end badly for you. That lesson apparently needs reinforcing." I turned back to the assembled nobles, my voice returning to its normal authoritative tone. "Grandmaster Nightingale's marriages represent strategic victories for the Slatemark Empire, not threats to our sovereignty. Any attempt to undermine these alliances would damage our international position and economic interests." The political argument was sound, but I wasn't finished with Valerian personally. "Furthermore," I said, looking directly at my brother with the kind of cold assessment that had always terrified him, "anyone attempting to create political instability based on personal grievances rather than legitimate imperial concerns would be acting against the Empire's interests." I moved closer to where Valerian stood, noting how he unconsciously stepped backward as I approached. The childhood dynamic between us had never really changed. I had always been smarter, more politically astute, and more willing to use whatever tools were necessary to achieve my objectives. "Do you understand me, brother?" I asked quietly, making sure only he could hear the full implications of my words. "This isn't a game you can win. These aren't opponents you can overcome. Walk away now, while you still have the option to do so with dignity intact." Valerian's hands were trembling slightly as the full weight of his situation became clear. He had expected to rally noble support against Arthur based on nationalist sentiment and personal grievance, but instead he had exposed his own weakness while giving me the opportunity to demonstrate my superior political position. He began, then stopped as he realized he had no viable response. The nobles around the table were watching him with expressions that ranged from pity to contempt, clearly recognizing that he had been comprehensively outmaneuvered by his younger sister. "The Imperial Council thanks Prince Valerian for raising his concerns," I said formally, returning to my seat while making it clear the discussion was over. "However, after careful consideration, it is the Empire's position that Grandmaster Nightingale's marriages represent strategic advantages that serve our national interests." The finality in my voice made it clear that any further challenges to this position would be treated as opposition to imperial policy itself. Valerian stood frozen in place, clearly struggling to process how quickly his grand political gesture had been turned into public humiliation. "The session is concluded," I announced, watching as nobles began filing out while carefully avoiding eye contact with Valerian. "The Empire's position on this matter is now official policy." As the council chamber emptied, Valerian remained standing near the center of the room, his face cycling through emotions too complex for most observers to follow. The confident prince who had called this session was gone, replaced by someone who looked remarkably like the broken 12-year-old I remembered from our childhood. "Cecilia," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're done here," I replied without looking up from the reports I was organizing. "Go home, Valerian. Count yourself fortunate that I chose to handle this privately rather than making your humiliation a public spectacle." He turned to leave, moving with the defeated posture of someone who had just learned a lesson he should have remembered from childhood. But as he reached the chamber's main entrance, I noticed my father standing quietly in the doorway, watching the entire scene with unreadable expression. Emperor Quinn Slatemark stepped aside to let Valerian pass, then entered the chamber with the kind of measured pace that suggested he had been observing for some time. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere. Where I commanded authority through political skill and status, my father's authority was absolute and unquestionable. "Father," I said, rising from my seat with the respect due the emperor while wondering how much of the confrontation he had witnessed. "Valerian will live a quiet life as a count," he said simply, the words carrying implications that hit me like a physical blow. Effective immediately. The announcement stunned me into momentary silence. Stripping Valerian of his princely status and reducing him to a county title was a punishment so severe it essentially amounted to exile from imperial life entirely. "Father," I said carefully, "what aren't you telling me?" But Emperor Quinn was already moving toward the chamber's exit, leaving me alone with the realization that whatever I thought I knew about Valerian's situation, there were clearly larger forces at work than I had anticipated.